A butcher's knife glinted in the moonlight as it plunged through flesh and bone 37 times. The screams that echoed through the darkness of that February night in Aberdeen, Australia, would haunt investigators for decades to come. What they discovered the next morning defied human comprehension. A crime so grotesque, so unthinkably savage, that it rewrote the boundaries of evil itself. This is the story of Catherine Mary Knight, the woman who transformed love into a literal feast of horror, becoming Australia's first female offender sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A slaughterhouse worker by trade, she would apply her professional skills in the most nightmarish way imaginable, turning her own home into an abattoir where human flesh became the main course. The blood-soaked trail she left behind would forever change how the world viewed the capacity for human brutality. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you enjoy these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. We'll be telling 5 different true crime stories in this video, each one more haunting than the last. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, feel free to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. This is the story The Butcher's Wife, the Catherine Knight story. The genesis of evil often begins in childhood, and Catherine Mary Knight's story was no exception. Born on October 24, 1955, in Tenterfield, New South Wales, Catherine entered a world already stained with violence and dysfunction. Her mother, Barbara Ruffin, bore 8 children from various relationships, creating a chaotic household where stability was a foreign concept and brutality was commonplace. The Knight family patriarch, Ken Knight, worked in local slaughterhouses, his hands perpetually stained with the blood of livestock. Young Catherine would watch, fascinated, as her father described his work with disturbing enthusiasm. The smell of death and the sight of carcasses became as familiar to her as playground games were to other children. This early exposure to systematic killing and butchery planted seeds that would later bloom into something far more sinister. Barbara Ruffin was a woman plagued by her own demons. Neighbors whispered about her erratic behavior, her explosive temper, and the way violence seemed to follow her family like a curse. She raised her children with an iron fist wrapped in razor wire, teaching them that aggression was the solution to every problem. Catherine absorbed these lessons with an intensity that worried even her hardened mother. School became another battleground for Catherine. Teachers described her as intelligent but volatile, a child whose mood could shift from calm to explosive in mere seconds. She exhibited troubling behaviors early on, torturing small animals, setting fires, and displaying an unusual fascination with knives and sharp objects. Her classmates learned to keep their distance, sensing something predatory lurking behind her seemingly ordinary exterior. The educational system failed Catherine spectacularly. Despite clear warning signs of psychological disturbance, no intervention came. She slipped through the cracks of a system ill-equipped to identify and treat children displaying early psychopathic tendencies. Her teachers, overwhelmed and under-resourced, simply labeled her as difficult and hoped she would outgrow her disturbing behaviors. At 15, Catherine made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of her life. She left school and followed her father into the meat industry, taking a job at a local slaughterhouse. While other teenagers were navigating the typical challenges of adolescence, Catherine was learning to kill, gut, and butcher animals with mechanical precision. The slaughterhouse became her sanctuary, a place where her natural inclination toward violence was not only accepted but praised. Her supervisors marveled at her efficiency and apparent lack of squeamishness. While other new employees often quit within days, unable to stomach the constant death and gore, Catherine thrived. She displayed an almost supernatural ability to disconnect from the violence, treating the systematic killing as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her colleagues began to notice unsettling patterns in Catherine's behavior. She seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the killing process, often volunteering for the most gruesome tasks. She would linger over particularly difficult butchering jobs, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that made even hardened slaughterhouse workers uncomfortable. The way she handled her knives was almost artistic, fluid, precise, and undeniably lethal. Catherine's reputation spread throughout the meatpacking district. She became known as someone who could handle any job, no matter how brutal or challenging. Her expertise with blades was legendary, and her ability to reduce a carcass to perfectly cut portions in record time earned her both respect and fear from her peers. Outside the slaughterhouse, Catherine's social development remained stunted. She struggled to form meaningful relationships, viewing other people through the same lens she applied to the animals she butchered daily. Empathy was a foreign concept, replaced by a calculating assessment of weakness and vulnerability in others. Her first romantic relationship began when she was 18, with a local man named David Kellett. The relationship was marked by Catherine's increasing need to control and dominate her partner. She displayed violent tendencies early in their courtship, but Kellett, like many who would follow, mistook her possessiveness for passion and her aggression for strength. The couple married in 1974, but their union was doomed from the start. Catherine's violent outbursts became more frequent and more severe. She would fly into homicidal rages over minor disagreements, often wielding kitchen knives as she screamed threats of dismemberment and death. Kellett found himself walking on eggshells, never knowing what might trigger his wife's explosive temper. Their first child was born in 1976, followed by another daughter in 1980. Motherhood did nothing to soften Catherine's edges. If anything, it seemed to sharpen them. She treated her children with the same cold efficiency she applied to her work, viewing them as possessions rather than individuals with their own needs and desires. The abuse in the Kellett household escalated steadily. Catherine's violence wasn't limited to verbal threats and intimidation. She began physically assaulting her husband, using her professional knowledge of anatomy to inflict maximum pain without leaving obvious marks. She knew exactly where to strike to cause agony without causing visible damage that might alert outside authorities. Kellett's family and friends urged him to leave, but Catherine's psychological manipulation had taken its toll. She had systematically isolated him from his support network, convinced him that he was worthless without her, and threatened increasingly severe consequences if he ever attempted to escape their toxic relationship. The breaking point came during one particularly violent episode when Catherine attacked Kellett with a carving knife, missing vital organs by mere millimeters. The sight of his own blood flowing freely finally snapped him back to reality. He realized that his wife was capable of murder, and that he might be her first victim if he didn't act quickly. Kellett's escape from the marriage was dramatic and desperate. He fled in the middle of the night, taking only the clothes on his back and leaving his children behind, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He later described the marriage as living with a ticking time bomb, never knowing when Catherine's violence would escalate from threats to lethal action. The divorce proceedings revealed the true extent of Catherine's psychological disturbance. Court documents detailed years of domestic abuse, death threats, and behavior so erratic that even experienced family court judges were disturbed by the testimonies. Catherine showed no remorse for her actions, instead blaming Kellett for not being man enough to handle her passionate nature. Free from her first marriage, Catherine began a pattern that would define the rest of her life. She cycled through a series of relationships, each one following the same destructive trajectory. The initial charm and seduction would give way to possessiveness and control, followed by escalating violence that ultimately drove her partners away. Her second serious relationship was with a man named David Saunders. Like Kellett before him, Saunders was initially drawn to Catherine's intensity and apparent passion. He mistook her obsessive behavior for devotion and her controlling nature for caring. The relationship produced another child, but followed the familiar pattern of escalating abuse and violence. Saunders later described living with Catherine as psychological warfare. She used her knowledge of human anatomy, gained from years of butchering animals, to make increasingly specific and graphic threats about how she would kill him if he ever left her. She would demonstrate her knife skills on pieces of meat while describing exactly how she would apply the same techniques to his body. The violence in Catherine's relationships wasn't random or impulsive. It was calculated, systematic, and designed to achieve maximum psychological impact. She understood that the threat of violence could be just as effective as violence itself in controlling her partners. Her professional expertise with knives and her detailed knowledge of how to inflict pain made her threats particularly credible and terrifying. Catherine's children grew up in this atmosphere of constant tension and fear. They witnessed their mother's violent outbursts, heard her graphic threats, and learned to navigate the unpredictable landscape of her moods. The psychological damage inflicted on these innocent victims would affect them for the rest of their lives, perpetuating a cycle of dysfunction and trauma. As Catherine's reputation for violence spread throughout her community, she found it increasingly difficult to maintain relationships. Men who might have been initially attracted to her began to hear whispered warnings from friends and family members. Her dating pool shrank, forcing her to become more desperate and more violent in her attempts to keep the partners she did manage to attract. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shock the world. Catherine Knight, now in her 40s, was becoming increasingly unstable and increasingly dangerous. Her professional skills with knives, her detailed knowledge of anatomy, and her complete lack of empathy for human suffering were converging into a perfect storm of potential violence. Her next relationship would be her last. John Charles Thomas Price, a 45-year-old father of 3, was about to become the focal point of Catherine's most extreme and horrific expression of her murderous nature. The countdown to an unthinkable crime had already begun, though Price had no way of knowing that his new girlfriend possessed the skills and the mindset necessary to transform him from a living, breathing human being into something far more sinister. The foundations of Catherine Knight's monstrous nature had been laid in her childhood and reinforced throughout her adult relationships. Years of systematic violence, professional training in butchery, and an almost supernatural ability to dehumanize others had created a predator unlike any the world had ever seen. The only question remaining was when, not if, this deadly combination of factors would explode into an act of unspeakable horror. John Charles Thomas Price was the kind of man who believed in second chances and the power of love to heal wounded souls. Born in 1955, the same year as Catherine Knight, he had lived a life marked by hard work, dedication to his children, and an almost fatal optimism about human nature. These very qualities that made him a good man would ultimately make him the perfect victim for Catherine's twisted desires. Price worked as a mine worker in Aberdeen, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. He was well liked by his colleagues, known for his reliability and his willingness to help others. Standing 6 feet tall with graying hair and gentle eyes, he possessed the kind of quiet strength that attracted troubled women seeking stability and protection. His first marriage had ended in divorce, leaving him with 3 children to raise largely on his own. Despite the challenges of single parenthood, Price maintained a close relationship with his kids and was determined to provide them with a stable, loving home environment. His friends often commented on his devotion to his family and his ability to find joy in simple pleasures despite life's setbacks. In 1995, at the age of 40, Price met Catherine Knight through mutual friends. Catherine was between relationships at the time, having recently ended another tumultuous affair that had followed her familiar pattern of seduction, control, and violence. To Price, she initially appeared to be exactly what he was looking for: a strong, independent woman who could match his own resilience and determination. Catherine's initial courtship of Price was masterful in its calculated deception. She presented herself as a devoted partner who had been repeatedly wronged by weak men who couldn't handle a passionate relationship. She portrayed her history of violence as evidence of her loyalty and intensity, convincing Price that her previous partners had simply been too inadequate to deserve her fierce devotion. Price was particularly impressed by Catherine's work ethic and her skill as a butcher. In his working-class world, the ability to perform difficult manual labor was respected and admired. He saw her professional expertise as evidence of her strength and capabilities, not recognizing the darker implications of her comfort with systematic killing and dismemberment. The early months of their relationship followed Catherine's established pattern. She showered Price with attention and affection, making him feel like the center of her universe. She cooked elaborate meals featuring her own expertly butchered meats, demonstrating her culinary skills while simultaneously showcasing her knife work in a way that Price found impressive rather than threatening. Catherine moved into Price's home within a few months of their meeting, bringing with her an extensive collection of knives and butchering equipment. She explained that these tools were necessary for her work, and Price accepted this explanation without question. He even admired the quality and sharpness of her blade collection, not realizing that he was essentially allowing a weapons arsenal into his own home. The transition from courtship to cohabitation marked the beginning of Catherine's campaign to isolate and control Price. She began systematically undermining his relationships with friends and family members, using a combination of charm and subtle manipulation to drive wedges between Price and his support network. She convinced him that his friends were jealous of their relationship and that his family members were trying to interfere in their happiness. Catherine's professional knowledge became a tool of intimidation disguised as expertise. She would casually demonstrate her knife skills while preparing meals, showing Price how easily she could reduce large pieces of meat to precise cuts. She would describe in clinical detail the anatomy of the animals she butchered, explaining which cuts would cause the most damage and which techniques would be most efficient for different purposes. Price initially found these demonstrations educational and even impressive. He admired Catherine's professional competence and her obvious mastery of her trade. He failed to recognize that she was essentially providing him with a preview of her own capabilities, showing him exactly what she was capable of doing to a body, any body. As their relationship progressed, Catherine's need for control became more apparent. She monitored Price's activities obsessively, demanding to know where he was going, who he would be with, and when he would return. She would show up unexpectedly at his workplace or at social gatherings, claiming that she simply missed him but actually checking up on his behavior. The first signs of physical violence appeared about a year into their relationship. Catherine's explosive temper, initially directed at inanimate objects or abstract frustrations, began to focus on Price himself. The attack started small: a slap during an argument, a shove when he disagreed with her, a thrown object when he failed to meet her expectations. Price's reaction to these early incidents was typical of many domestic violence victims. He rationalized Catherine's behavior, convincing himself that her violence was a result of stress or miscommunication rather than a fundamental aspect of her personality. He believed that his love and patience could help her overcome whatever demons were driving her aggressive behavior. Catherine's escalation followed a predictable pattern, but one that Price couldn't recognize without proper education about domestic abuse cycles. After each violent incident, she would apologize profusely, shower him with affection, and promise that it would never happen again. These honeymoon periods became shorter and less convincing as the relationship progressed, but they were still sufficient to keep Price emotionally invested in the relationship. The psychological manipulation accompanying Catherine's physical abuse was particularly sophisticated. She convinced Price that her violence was actually a sign of her passion and devotion to him. She claimed that she only became aggressive because she loved him so much that the thought of losing him drove her to temporary madness. This twisted logic kept Price trapped in a cycle of violence and reconciliation. Catherine's professional background gave her threats a credibility that threats from other abusers might have lacked. When she described in graphic detail how she would dismember Price if he ever left her, he couldn't dismiss these threats as empty bluster. He had seen her work with knives, knew her anatomical knowledge, and understood that she possessed both the skills and the tools necessary to carry out her most horrific promises. The isolation campaign intensified as Catherine's violence escalated. She systematically destroyed Price's relationships with anyone who might serve as a source of support or a voice of reason. She would start arguments with his friends and family members, then blame Price for the resulting conflicts. She convinced him that maintaining these relationships was disloyal to their partnership. Price's children became particular targets of Catherine's manipulation. She resented the attention and resources that Price devoted to his kids, viewing them as competition for his loyalty and affection. She would create situations designed to force Price to choose between his children and his relationship with her, gradually eroding his connections with the people who mattered most to him. The professional butcher's knowledge that had initially impressed Price became an increasingly prominent feature of Catherine's threats and intimidation tactics. She would describe in clinical detail exactly how she would kill him if he ever attempted to leave her. She explained which knife techniques would be most effective, which parts of his anatomy would be most vulnerable, and how long he would survive various types of wounds. These threats weren't delivered in the heat of passion or during explosive arguments. Catherine would make them calmly, almost casually, while performing routine activities around the house. She might describe her murder fantasies while sharpening her knives or explain her dismemberment plans while preparing dinner. This matter-of-fact delivery made her threats even more terrifying and believable. Price began to show signs of the psychological damage that prolonged exposure to domestic abuse creates in victims. His friends and colleagues noticed changes in his behavior, increased anxiety, social withdrawal, and a general nervousness that hadn't been present before his relationship with Catherine. He started making excuses for her behavior and defending her actions even when others expressed concern for his safety. The financial control that Catherine exerted over Price was another aspect of her systematic campaign to dominate every aspect of his life. She convinced him to give her access to his bank accounts and control over his household expenses. She claimed that her superior money management skills would benefit both of them, but in reality, she was creating another barrier to his potential escape from the relationship. Catherine's violence wasn't limited to threats and psychological manipulation. The physical abuse escalated steadily throughout their relationship, with each incident becoming more severe and more dangerous. She would attack Price with household objects, including knives from her professional collection. She seemed to derive genuine pleasure from causing him pain, often smiling or laughing during her most violent outbursts. The sexual aspect of Catherine's abuse added another layer of complexity to Price's psychological imprisonment. She used intimacy as both a reward for compliance and a weapon for punishment. She would withhold affection when Price failed to meet her expectations, then use sexual reconciliation to reinforce his emotional dependence on her approval. Friends and family members who tried to intervene in Price's relationship with Catherine faced her wrath directly. She would confront anyone who attempted to warn Price about her behavior, using a combination of charm, manipulation, and direct threats to silence potential sources of support. Her reputation for violence preceded her, making people reluctant to get involved in what they perceived as a dangerous situation. Price's workplace became one of the few remaining spaces where he could escape Catherine's constant surveillance and control. However, even this refuge was gradually compromised as Catherine began showing up at his job site, calling him constantly, and generally making her presence felt in every aspect of his professional life. The psychological trauma of living under constant threat of violence began to affect Price's physical health. He developed stress-related symptoms including chronic headaches, insomnia, and digestive problems. His immune system was compromised by the constant state of hypervigilance required to navigate Catherine's unpredictable moods and violent outbursts. Despite the escalating danger of his situation, Price remained trapped in the relationship through a combination of psychological manipulation, social isolation, and genuine fear for his safety. Catherine's threats had convinced him that attempting to leave would result in his death, and her demonstrated expertise with knives made these threats credible in a way that similar threats from other abusers might not have been. The final phase of Price's entrapment began in early 2000. Catherine's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent, suggesting that her psychological deterioration was accelerating towards some kind of breaking point. Her threats became more frequent and more graphic, and her violence became more severe and less connected to any apparent trigger or provocation. Price finally began to recognize the true danger of his situation, but by then it might have been too late. Catherine had systematically eliminated his support network, gained control over his resources, and positioned herself as the center of his world. Escape would require careful planning, external support, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to overcome years of psychological conditioning that had taught him to prioritize Catherine's needs over his own safety. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end with one of the most horrific crimes in Australian history. John Price, a good man who had tried to love a damaged woman back to health, was about to discover that some wounds are too deep to heal and some monsters are too dangerous to tame. His compassion and optimism, the very qualities that made him a good person, were about to become the tools of his own destruction. February 29, 2000, dawned like any other day in Aberdeen, New South Wales. The Australian summer was drawing to a close, and the small mining town bustled with its usual rhythms of work and family life. John Price had no way of knowing that this leap year day would be his last on Earth, or that the woman sharing his bed harbored intentions so monstrous that they would forever change how the world viewed the depths of human depravity. The tension in the Price household had been escalating for weeks leading up to that fateful night. Catherine's behavior had become increasingly erratic and threatening, even by her own violent standards. Her mood swings had intensified, cycling between periods of false affection and explosive rage with frightening unpredictability. Price found himself walking on increasingly thin ice, never knowing what innocent comment or action might trigger Catherine's wrath. Earlier that day, Catherine had received news that would serve as the final catalyst for her murderous plans. Price had finally summoned the courage to end their toxic relationship, informing her that he wanted her to move out of his home. After years of psychological and physical abuse, he had reached his breaking point and decided that no relationship was worth the constant fear and violence that characterized his life with Catherine. Catherine's reaction to this news was swift and terrifying. Rather than accepting Price's decision or attempting to negotiate a reconciliation, she immediately began plotting his destruction. Her professional experience as a butcher had taught her that the most efficient kills were those that were carefully planned and executed with precision. She would apply these same principles to the murder of the man she claimed to love. Throughout the day, Catherine maintained a facade of normalcy while internally preparing for the horror she intended to unleash. She went about her usual routines, preparing meals and engaging in casual conversation, all while her mind calculated the logistics of murder and dismemberment. Her years of professional experience had taught her that successful butchery required careful preparation and the right tools for the job. Price, unaware of the deadly thoughts churning in Catherine's mind, went about his final day with the naive optimism that had characterized his entire relationship with her. He believed that their breakup could be handled civilly, that Catherine would accept his decision and move on with her life. His fundamental decency prevented him from recognizing the true depths of her malevolence. As evening approached, Catherine began her preparations in earnest. She gathered her collection of professional butchering knives, selecting the specific blades that would be most effective for her intended purpose. Her experience had taught her that different knives were optimal for different stages of the butchering process, and she intended to apply this professional knowledge to human flesh. The couple shared their final dinner together around 6 p.m., with Catherine displaying none of the rage or instability that had marked her behavior earlier in the day. She was calm, almost serene, as she served the meal she had prepared. Price found her sudden change in demeanor reassuring, interpreting it as evidence that she was accepting their breakup more gracefully than he had expected. After dinner, they watched television together, maintaining the pretense of a normal domestic evening. Catherine even engaged in casual conversation about mundane topics, giving no indication of the monstrous thoughts occupying her mind. Her ability to compartmentalize her murderous intentions while maintaining a facade of normalcy demonstrated a level of psychological calculation that would horrify investigators. Around 11 p.m., Price announced that he was tired and ready for bed. Catherine agreed that they should retire for the evening, though she had no intention of sleeping. As Price prepared for what he believed would be just another night's rest, Catherine was finalizing the details of his murder in her mind. Price fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the emotional stress of ending their relationship and the physical demands of his work at the mine. Catherine lay beside him in the darkness, listening to his breathing and waiting for the optimal moment to begin her attack. Her experience with slaughterhouse animals had taught her that the most humane kills occurred when the victim was unaware and unable to struggle. Sometime after midnight, Catherine rose silently from the bed and retrieved her carefully selected butcher knife from its hiding place. The blade was razor-sharp, honed to the same precision she demanded in her professional work. She had chosen this particular knife because of its length and weight distribution, qualities that would allow her to inflict maximum damage with minimum effort. The first strike came without warning, plunging deep into Price's sleeping form with the practiced precision of someone who had killed countless animals. The blade found its mark with surgical accuracy, guided by Catherine's intimate knowledge of anatomy and her years of experience in locating vital organs and major blood vessels. Price awakened in agony and confusion, his consciousness returning to find himself under savage attack by the woman he had shared his bed with for years. The darkness of the bedroom was punctuated by the glint of steel and the spray of his own blood as Catherine continued her methodical assault on his body. Driven by survival instinct, Price attempted to escape from his attacker and flee to safety. Despite his severe injuries, he managed to get out of bed and stumble toward the bedroom door, leaving a trail of blood that would later provide investigators with a horrific map of his final moments. His desperate flight through his own home became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Catherine pursuing him with relentless determination. The chase that followed was brief but brutal. Catherine's superior physical condition and her uninjured state gave her a significant advantage over her wounded victim. She caught up with Price in the hallway, continuing her savage attack with the mechanical efficiency of a professional butcher processing livestock. Each strike of the knife was delivered with calculated precision, designed to cause maximum damage while preventing Price from mounting any effective defense. Catherine's professional training had taught her exactly where to strike to incapacitate her victim, and she applied this knowledge with ruthless efficiency to the murder of her former lover. Price managed to reach the front door of his home, perhaps hoping to escape into the night or alert neighbors to his desperate situation. However, his injuries were too severe and Catherine's pursuit too relentless. He collapsed just inside the doorway, his strength finally failing as his life ebbed away through multiple traumatic wounds. The official autopsy would later reveal that Price had been stabbed 37 times, with wounds covering his head, neck, chest, and back. The pattern and depth of the wounds demonstrated a level of violence that shocked even experienced forensic investigators who had seen decades of homicide scenes. Catherine had not merely killed Price. She had utterly destroyed his body with the same thoroughness she applied to her professional butchering work. But the murder itself was only the beginning of Catherine's descent into absolute depravity. What happened next would elevate her crime from a domestic homicide to something approaching the supernatural in its pure malevolence. Rather than fleeing the scene or attempting to cover up her crime, Catherine began to implement the second phase of her horrific plan. Using the same knives she had used to murder Price, Catherine began the process of skinning and dismembering his corpse. Her years of professional experience guided her hands as she methodically removed his skin in large sections, using techniques perfected on countless animal carcasses. The precision of her cuts demonstrated that this wasn't a crime of passion or temporary insanity, but rather the careful execution of a premeditated plan. Catherine hung Price's skin from a meat hook that she had installed in the living room ceiling, displaying her gruesome trophy like a prize from a successful hunt. The sight would later traumatize the police officers who discovered the scene, grown men reduced to tears by the sheer inhumanity of what they witnessed. The dismemberment process continued throughout the early morning hours, with Catherine applying her professional skills to reduce Price's body to manageable portions. She separated his head from his torso with the same clinical detachment she might have shown while processing a lamb or pig carcass. Her movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting that she had mentally rehearsed this process many times before carrying it out. Catherine then began the most depraved aspect of her crime, the preparation of Price's flesh for consumption. She placed portions of his body into cooking pots and pans, seasoning the human meat with vegetables and spices as if she were preparing a conventional meal. Her culinary skills, developed through years of cooking the animals she butchered professionally, were now being applied to human flesh. The head was placed in a large pot along with vegetables, creating a macabre stew that would have been horrifying enough if discovered by investigators. However, Catherine's plans extended beyond simple cannibalism. She intended to serve Price's cooked remains to his own children when they returned home from visiting their mother. 2 plates were set at the dining table, each containing portions of their father's cooked flesh arranged as if they were ordinary dinner plates. Catherine had even included side dishes and garnishes, treating the cannibalistic meal as if it were a normal family dinner. The calculated nature of this preparation demonstrated a level of premeditation and psychological detachment that defied comprehension. Place cards were prepared with the children's names, ensuring that each would know their designated seat at this hellish banquet. Catherine had even selected appropriate utensils and napkins, attending to every detail of her monstrous dinner party. Her attention to these mundane aspects of meal preparation, even while working with human flesh, revealed a psychological dissociation that bordered on the supernatural. Throughout the night, Catherine worked with the methodical efficiency of a professional butcher, never showing any signs of remorse or psychological breakdown. She treated Price's corpse as raw material for her gruesome project, displaying no more emotional connection to his remains than she had shown to the animal carcasses she processed during her regular workday. As dawn approached, Catherine surveyed her horrific handiwork with apparent satisfaction. The living room had been transformed into a charnel house, with blood splattered across the walls and Price's skin hanging from the ceiling like a grotesque decoration. The kitchen contained the remnants of her cooking activities, with human flesh prepared and ready for serving to unsuspecting victims. Catherine then did something that would puzzle investigators for years to come. Rather than fleeing the scene or attempting to destroy evidence of her crime, she took an overdose of prescription medications and collapsed near the front door of the house. Whether this was a genuine suicide attempt or simply part of her plan to avoid immediate detection remains unclear. Her unconscious body was discovered hours later by police officers conducting a welfare check. Price's children had become concerned when their father failed to answer phone calls, and they had contacted authorities to request that someone check on his well-being. The officers who responded to this routine request were completely unprepared for the nightmare they were about to encounter. The discovery of Catherine's crime scene would traumatize everyone who witnessed it, from the first responding officers to the experienced detectives who later processed the evidence. Grown men with decades of law enforcement experience were reduced to physical illness by the sheer depravity of what Catherine had created in that house. The night of February 29, 2000, had ended with one of the most horrific crimes in Australian history. Catherine Knight had transformed her home into an abattoir, her lover into dinner, and herself into a monster whose actions would haunt everyone who learned about them. The woman who had spent her professional life killing and butchering animals had finally applied those skills to a human victim, creating a crime that redefined the boundaries of human evil. The discovery of John Price's butchered remains sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Aberdeen and reverberating across Australia and the world. When police officers arrived at Price's home on the morning of March 1, 2000, responding to a routine welfare check, they were wholly unprepared for the scene of unimaginable horror that awaited them inside. Senior Constable Bob Wells, a veteran officer with over 20 years of experience, was the first to enter the house. His initial concern was simply locating Price and ensuring his well-being. Wells had seen his share of domestic disturbances, accidents, and even homicides during his career, but nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he discovered in the Price residence. The smell hit him first, a sickening combination of blood, death, and cooking meat that immediately triggered his gag reflex. As Wells moved deeper into the house, following the trail of blood that led from the bedroom to the living room, he began to comprehend the magnitude of the horror that had unfolded within these walls. The sight of Price's skin hanging from the meat hook in the living room caused Wells to stumble backward in shock and disbelief. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing, unable to immediately accept that a human being had been skinned and displayed like a hunting trophy. The precision of the skinning job revealed a level of anatomical knowledge and butchering expertise that transformed murder into something approaching an art form. Wells immediately called for backup and supervisory support, his voice shaking as he attempted to describe the scene to his dispatcher. The veteran officer, who had maintained his composure during countless traumatic situations throughout his career, found himself overwhelmed by the sheer depravity of Catherine's handiwork. Detective Inspector Bob Ryan, the senior investigator assigned to the case, arrived shortly after the initial discovery. Ryan had investigated hundreds of homicides during his distinguished career, but even his extensive experience with violent crime failed to prepare him for what he encountered in the Price house. Years later, He would describe it as the most disturbing crime scene he had ever witnessed. The kitchen revealed the full extent of Catherine's cannibalistic intentions. The carefully prepared plates of human flesh, complete with vegetables and seasonings, demonstrated a level of premeditation and psychological detachment that horrified even experienced investigators. The place cards bearing the names of Price's children revealed the true depth of Catherine's malevolence. She had intended to force his own offspring to unknowingly consume their father's remains. Forensic investigators worked methodically to document every aspect of the crime scene, their professional composure barely concealing the psychological trauma they were experiencing. Photographer after photographer struggled to complete their documentation duties, with several requiring medical attention for stress-related symptoms brought on by prolonged exposure to the horrific images. The autopsy of Price's remains, conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. Timothy Lyons, revealed the full extent of the violence Catherine had inflicted. The 37 stab wounds told the story of a sustained and brutal attack that continued long after Price was incapacitated. The precision of the cuts and the anatomical knowledge demonstrated in the dismemberment process confirmed that Catherine had applied her professional butchering skills to the murder and mutilation of her victim. Dr. Lyons noted that the wounds demonstrated a systematic approach to killing, with each strike calculated to cause maximum damage while maintaining the integrity of the flesh for later butchering. The pattern of injuries suggested that Catherine had methodically worked to ensure Price's death while preserving his body for her cannibalistic purposes. The psychological evaluation of Catherine Knight became a priority for investigators attempting to understand the mind behind such incomprehensible violence. Dr. Robert Delaforce, a forensic psychiatrist with extensive experience in criminal psychology, was assigned to evaluate Catherine's mental state and determine her fitness to stand trial. Catherine's behavior during her initial interviews was as disturbing as her crime itself. She showed no remorse for Price's murder, instead expressing anger that her plans had been interrupted before she could serve his flesh to his children. She spoke about the killing with the same detached professionalism she might have used to describe her work at the slaughterhouse, referring to Price's body as meat and discussing her butchering techniques with obvious pride. When asked about her motivations for the crime, Catherine provided responses that chilled even experienced psychiatrists. She explained that she had killed Price because he had tried to leave her, and she believed that by consuming his flesh and feeding it to his children, she would ensure that he could never truly be separated from her. Her twisted logic revealed a mind completely disconnected from normal human emotional responses. Dr. Delaforce's evaluation revealed a complex psychological profile that combined elements of antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and psychopathy. Catherine demonstrated a complete lack of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, and a grandiose sense of self-importance that allowed her to justify any action as acceptable if it served her purposes. The psychiatrist was particularly disturbed by Catherine's matter-of-fact description of her crime. She provided detailed accounts of the murder and dismemberment process without showing any emotional response, as if she were describing a routine work task rather than the brutal killing of someone she claimed to love. This level of emotional detachment suggested a degree of psychological pathology rarely encountered even in forensic settings. Catherine's family history provided additional context for understanding the development of her monstrous personality. Interviews with relatives revealed a pattern of violence and dysfunction that stretched back generations. Her mother, Barbara Ruffin, had herself been the victim of domestic violence and had raised her children in an environment where aggression was normalized and empathy was discouraged. The investigation into Catherine's past relationships revealed a consistent pattern of escalating violence that had been building toward this ultimate expression of her homicidal nature. David Kellett, her first husband, came forward to describe years of threats and physical abuse that had left him psychologically traumatized. He revealed that Catherine had often threatened to kill and butcher him, descriptions that investigators now realized had been literal rather than metaphorical. David Saunders, Catherine's second long-term partner, provided similar testimony about the systematic campaign of terror she had conducted against him. He described living in constant fear of her violence, particularly her detailed threats about how she would use her professional butchering skills to dismember him if he ever attempted to leave their relationship. These testimonies established a clear pattern of escalating violence that culminated in Price's murder. Catherine's threats of cannibalism and dismemberment, initially dismissed as extreme expressions of jealousy or anger, were revealed to have been genuine promises of what she intended to do to anyone who dared to cross her. The legal proceedings that followed Catherine's arrest captured international attention, as the world struggled to comprehend how a human being could commit such an inhuman act. The case presented unique challenges for the legal system, as there were no precedents for prosecuting someone who had not only committed murder, but had also engaged in cannibalism with the intent to feed human flesh to children. Crown Prosecutor Mark Tedeschi, one of Australia's most experienced prosecutors, was assigned to present the case against Catherine. Even his extensive experience with violent crime cases had not prepared him for the task of describing Catherine's actions to a jury. The challenge was not proving her guilt, the evidence was overwhelming, but rather presenting the facts in a way that would allow the jury to comprehend and process the full extent of her depravity. Catherine's defense team, led by experienced criminal lawyer Peter Thraves, faced the impossible task of mounting a defense for actions that seemed to defy any rational explanation. Their primary strategy was to argue that Catherine was mentally ill and therefore not criminally responsible for her actions. However, this defense was complicated by the clear evidence of premeditation and the calculated nature of her crime. The trial began on October 15, 2001, in the New South Wales Supreme Court in Sydney. Justice Barry O'Keefe presided over proceedings that would become a landmark in Australian legal history. The case attracted massive media attention, with reporters and observers struggling to find appropriate language to describe the horrific details that emerged during testimony. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Forensic evidence clearly established Catherine's guilt, while testimony from her previous partners demonstrated a pattern of violence and threats that had escalated to this ultimate expression of homicidal rage. The crime scene photographs, shown to the jury in carefully controlled circumstances, provided visual evidence of the true extent of Catherine's depravity. Catherine's own statements to police and psychiatrists were particularly damaging to any potential defense. Her lack of remorse, combined with her detailed descriptions of the murder and her expressed regret that she had been prevented from completing her cannibalistic plans, demonstrated a level of psychological pathology that transcended any conventional understanding of mental illness. The defense team's attempts to portray Catherine as mentally ill were undermined by expert testimony that established her ability to distinguish between right and wrong at the time of the crime. While she was clearly psychologically disturbed, the legal definition of insanity requires that a defendant be unable to understand the nature and consequences of their actions, a standard that Catherine clearly failed to meet. Dr. Delaforce's testimony was particularly compelling in establishing Catherine's criminal responsibility. He explained that while Catherine suffered from severe personality disorders, she retained the cognitive ability to understand that murder was wrong and to appreciate the consequences of her actions. Her careful planning of the crime and her attempts to avoid detection demonstrated rational thought processes despite her underlying psychological pathology. The jury deliberated for just over 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. The brevity of their deliberation suggested that the evidence of Catherine's guilt was so overwhelming that little discussion was necessary. The more challenging question was determining an appropriate sentence for someone who had committed such an unprecedented crime. Justice O'Keefe's sentencing remarks reflected the unique nature of Catherine's crime and its impact on the community's sense of safety and security. He described her actions as beyond the realm of human understanding, and noted that the crime had shattered conventional assumptions about the limits of human cruelty and depravity. On November 8, 2001, Justice O'Keefe sentenced Catherine Knight to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, making her the first woman in Australian history to receive such a sentence. The judge explained that the extreme nature of her crime, combined with her complete lack of remorse and the ongoing danger she posed to the community, justified this unprecedented punishment. The sentence effectively ensured that Catherine would spend the remainder of her life in prison, dying behind bars without any hope of freedom. The judge noted that her actions had placed her beyond the possibility of redemption or rehabilitation, representing a level of evil that could not be addressed through conventional correctional programs. Catherine's reaction to the sentence was as disturbing as her reaction to the crime itself. She showed no emotional response to learning that she would never be free again, instead appearing irritated that the proceedings were taking so long. Her complete indifference to the consequences of her actions reinforced the perception that she was fundamentally different from normal human beings. The case established important legal precedents regarding the prosecution of cannibalistic crimes and the application of life sentences without parole. Legal scholars noted that Catherine's case represented a new category of criminal behavior that challenged conventional frameworks for understanding and punishing violent crime. The psychological impact of Catherine's crime extended far beyond her immediate victims. The police officers who investigated the case required counseling to deal with the trauma of exposure to such extreme violence. The forensic specialists who processed the crime scene reported long-term psychological effects from their involvement in documenting the horror Catherine had created. The community of Aberdeen struggled to come to terms with the knowledge that such evil had existed in their midst. Residents reported feeling unsafe in their own homes, knowing that someone capable of such monstrous actions had lived among them undetected for years. The crime shattered the community's sense of security and trust in a way that would take years to heal. Price's children, the intended victims of Catherine's cannibalistic feast, required extensive psychological support to deal with the trauma of learning about their father's horrific death and their narrow escape from unknowingly consuming his flesh. The psychological damage inflicted on these innocent victims represented another dimension of Catherine's cruelty. Catherine's own children also became victims of her actions, forced to live with the knowledge that their mother was capable of such inhuman behavior. They faced the challenge of understanding how the woman who had raised them could commit such a monstrous act, while also dealing with the social stigma associated with being related to Australia's most notorious female killer. The media coverage of Catherine's crime introduced the general public to a level of violence that many had never imagined possible. The case became a cultural touchstone for discussions about the nature of evil and the limits of human depravity. True crime enthusiasts and criminologists continue to study the case as an example of the most extreme form of domestic violence ever documented. Catherine Knight remains incarcerated at Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre in New South Wales, where she will spend the remainder of her life. Prison officials report that she has shown no signs of remorse or psychological improvement during her decades of imprisonment. She continues to display the same lack of empathy and emotional connection that characterized her behavior before and after her crime. The woman who transformed her home into a slaughterhouse and her lover into a meal has become a symbol of ultimate human evil. Her name is spoken in the same breath as history's most notorious killers, a testament to the unprecedented nature of her crime and its lasting impact on everyone who learned about it. Catherine Knight's legacy is one of pure malevolence, a reminder that the capacity for evil exists within the human species to a degree that defies comprehension. Her crime stands as perhaps the most disturbing example of domestic violence ever recorded, a nightmare scenario that continues to horrify and fascinate more than 2 decades after its commission. The butcher's wife had finally applied her professional skills to human flesh, creating a crime that redefined the boundaries of evil and ensuring her place in the annals of criminal history as one of the most depraved killers ever to walk the earth. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters are real, and sometimes they share our beds, our homes, and our lives until the moment they reveal their true nature in an explosion of unthinkable violence. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Black Widow's Web, The Betty Newmer Chronicles. 5 wedding dresses, 5 obituaries, 5 coffins lowered into cold earth while one woman stood collecting life insurance checks with tears that never quite reached her eyes. Betty Newmer's husbands didn't just die. They were systematically eliminated, one by one, across decades of calculated carnage that would make even seasoned detectives question the very nature of evil itself. What kind of monster masquerades behind the facade of a loving wife? What darkness lurks behind a grandmother's gentle smile? This is the terrifying tale of America's most patient predator. A woman who turned matrimony into murder, love into a death sentence, and trust into the ultimate weapon of destruction. Welcome to the nightmare that is Betty Newmer's world, where death followed her like a shadow, and husbands were nothing more than walking paychecks waiting to be cashed in. This is not just a story of murder. It's the chilling chronicle of a woman who weaponized affection, turning the sacred bond of marriage into a spider's web of deceit, violence, and cold-blooded execution. The year was 1931, and evil was born wearing the innocent face of a newborn girl. Betty LaFawn Newmer entered this world on November 27, 1931, but the circumstances that would forge her into one of America's most feared female predators were already taking shape in the shadows of her childhood. What creates a killer? What twisted combination of nature and nurture transforms an infant into a calculating executioner who would eventually orchestrate the deaths of not one, not two, but potentially 5 husbands? The small-town atmosphere of Betty's early years provided the perfect camouflage for what was to come. She learned early that appearances mattered more than truth, that a sweet smile could hide the most venomous intentions, and that people were far too willing to believe in innocence when it came wrapped in feminine charm. These weren't just childhood lessons, they were the foundational elements of what would become her signature methodology of murder. Betty's transformation from seemingly innocent young woman to cold-blooded killer didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual metamorphosis, each relationship teaching her new techniques in manipulation, each interaction adding another tool to her ever-expanding arsenal of deception. She studied her victims with the precision of a surgeon, learning their weaknesses, understanding their desires, and most importantly, discovering exactly how much they were worth dead versus alive. The psychology of a serial killer often reveals itself in their choice of victims, and Betty's preference for husbands wasn't random. It was strategically brilliant. Marriage provided her with legal access to their finances, insurance policies, and most crucially, their absolute trust. A husband doesn't expect his loving wife to be plotting his demise over breakfast. A husband doesn't question why his spouse suddenly suggests increasing his life insurance policy. A husband doesn't suspect that the woman sharing his bed might be calculating the exact moment of his death. As Betty entered adulthood, she began to perfect what would become her signature approach, the slow, methodical seduction followed by the swift, brutal elimination. She didn't just marry for love. She married for profit. Each wedding ceremony wasn't a celebration of union, but rather a countdown timer to murder. Each I do was really, I will kill you when the time is right. Her first marriage would be the testing ground, the place where she would refine her techniques and discover just how easy it was to make murder look like accident or suicide. The naive young woman who walked down that first aisle would emerge from that relationship as something far more dangerous. A predator who had tasted blood and found she had an insatiable appetite for more. The community around Betty never suspected what was growing in their midst. How could they? She was charming, beautiful, and seemingly devoted to her husbands. She attended church, participated in community events, and played the role of the perfect wife with Academy Award-worthy performance skills. But behind that carefully constructed facade, something sinister was calculating, planning, and preparing to strike. What makes Betty's story particularly chilling is not just the number of victims, but the cold, systematic approach she took to each murder. This wasn't a woman who killed in passion or rage. This was a businesswoman who had turned murder into a profitable enterprise. Each husband was evaluated not for their capacity to love or their potential as a life partner, but for their net worth and the size of their insurance policies. The financial motivation wasn't just greed. It was the fuel that powered her killing machine. Betty collected approximately $20,000 in insurance money when Harold Gentry was killed, and even had herself listed as the beneficiary on her son's life insurance policy, despite him being married with children. These weren't crimes of passion. They were calculated business transactions where human lives were the commodity being traded for cash. As the years progressed, Betty's confidence grew along with her body count. Each successful murder taught her new lessons in avoiding detection, in manipulating crime scenes, and in presenting herself as the grieving widow rather than the calculating killer. She learned that tears were more valuable than alibis, that community sympathy could shield her from suspicion, and that playing the victim was far more effective than any elaborate cover-up. The transformation was complete. The innocent girl who had been born in 1931 no longer existed. In her place stood something far more terrifying, a woman who had weaponized matrimony itself, turning the most sacred of human bonds into a hunting ground where she was the apex predator and her husbands were nothing more than prey waiting to be harvested. But predators, no matter how careful, eventually make mistakes. And Betty's first mistake would come in the form of a man who refused to let his brother's death be forgotten. A man who would spend over 2 decades demanding justice, and ultimately, a man who would bring this house of horrors crashing down around the Black Widow who had built it on a foundation of corpses and lies. The stage was set. The killer had been created. And across the American landscape, unsuspecting men were about to encounter the most dangerous woman they would ever meet, though by the time they realized the truth, it would already be far too late to escape the web she had woven around them. The wedding bells that rang for Betty Newmer's first marriage weren't celebrating a union. They were tolling a death knell for the unfortunate man who had no idea he was marrying his own executioner. This first marriage would serve as Betty's apprenticeship in murder, the laboratory where she would perfect the deadly techniques that would claim 4 more victims over the coming decades. Her first husband never stood a chance. He was dealing with a woman who possessed a lethal combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to manipulate those around her. While he was planning their future together, she was calculating exactly when and how his life would end. While he was falling deeper in love, she was falling deeper into the twisted psychology of a killer who viewed marriage not as a partnership, but as a hunting license. The methods Betty employed weren't the crude, obvious approaches of amateur killers. She was far too intelligent for such pedestrian techniques. Instead, she crafted scenarios that appeared natural, accidental, or self-inflicted. She understood that the key to getting away with murder wasn't in the killing itself. It was in the aftermath, in controlling the narrative, in ensuring that when the dust settled, she was seen as the victim rather than the perpetrator. 3 of her 5 husbands would eventually die from gunshot wounds, but the circumstances surrounding each death were carefully orchestrated to deflect suspicion away from the common denominator that connected all these tragedies: Betty herself. She didn't just kill her husbands. She destroyed their reputations posthumously, crafting stories that painted them as unstable, violent, or suicidal men who had brought their own demise upon themselves. The psychological manipulation began long before the actual murders. Betty would systematically isolate her husbands from their friends and family members, creating an environment where she was their primary source of emotional support and validation. This wasn't just controlling behavior, it was tactical preparation for murder. By the time she was ready to strike, her victims had been so thoroughly cut off from their support networks that few people truly knew what was happening inside their marriages. She perfected the art of the double life, maintaining one persona for the outside world and revealing her true nature only to her victims, and even then, only in the final moments when it was already too late for them to escape or seek help. To their neighbors, she was the devoted wife. To their families, she was the caring daughter-in-law. To their friends, she was the supportive partner. But to her husbands, in those final terrifying moments of their lives, she revealed herself as the merciless killer she had always been. The financial aspect of her crimes wasn't just about the money, though the insurance payouts certainly motivated her actions. It was about power, control, and the intoxicating rush of knowing she could literally get away with murder. Each successful kill emboldened her, convinced her that she was smarter than the police, more cunning than the investigators, and more manipulative than anyone could possibly imagine. Betty's victim selection process was methodical and calculating. She didn't choose her husbands randomly. She targeted men who possessed specific characteristics that made them ideal victims. They needed to be financially stable enough to make their deaths profitable, isolated enough to be vulnerable to her manipulation, and trusting enough to never suspect that their loving wife might be planning their execution. The crime scenes themselves were masterpieces of deception. Betty understood that the physical evidence left behind would be scrutinized, so she crafted scenarios that told false stories to investigators. She planted evidence, manipulated witness statements, and created alibis that were virtually unshakable. Her understanding of police procedures and forensic techniques was surprisingly sophisticated for someone without formal training, suggesting that she had spent considerable time studying how murders were solved and how killers were caught. What makes these early murders particularly disturbing is the cold, businesslike approach Betty took to ending human lives. There was no passion, no rage, no emotional component whatsoever. These were executions carried out with the same level of emotion one might bring to balancing a checkbook or organizing a closet. The complete absence of empathy, remorse, or humanity in her approach to murder reveals the depth of her psychopathy and the calculating nature of her crimes. The aftermath of each murder followed a predictable pattern. Betty would play the role of the devastated widow, accepting condolences from neighbors and family members who had no idea they were comforting a cold-blooded killer. She would organize funerals with apparent grief, deliver touching eulogies about her deceased husbands, and collect sympathy along with insurance payments. The performance was flawless, the deception complete. But even the most careful killers leave traces of their crimes, and Betty's early murders would eventually provide investigators with crucial insights into her methods and motivations. The patterns that emerged from these deaths, the financial benefits, the isolated circumstances, the lack of witnesses, would ultimately become the foundation for understanding the true scope of her criminal enterprise. As Betty's confidence grew with each successful murder, so did her ambition. She began to see herself as invincible, untouchable, a criminal mastermind who had discovered the perfect crime. This hubris would eventually prove to be her downfall, but for now, she was riding high on a wave of successful kills and growing bank balances. The first chapter of her killing spree had concluded successfully. Her techniques had been tested and refined. Her methodology had been proven effective. And somewhere in the darkness of her twisted mind, Betty Neumer was already selecting her next victim, already planning the next wedding that would end in another funeral, already calculating the profit margins on another human life. The apprenticeship was over. The master killer had emerged, and the body count was just beginning. The 1986 murder of Harold Gentry sent shockwaves through the small town of Norwood, North Carolina. A beloved member of the community, Gentry didn't seem to have an enemy in the world. But Harold Gentry did have an enemy, one who slept beside him every night, who knew his every routine, his every weakness, and who had been planning his execution from the moment she said, "I do," at their wedding ceremony. Harold Gentry was Betty Neumer's fourth husband, and by this point in her murderous career, she had refined her killing techniques to a terrifying level of precision. This wasn't the work of an amateur killer stumbling through her first murder. This was the calculated execution carried out by a woman who had already successfully killed 3 men and was now applying everything she had learned to claim her next victim. Just before his death, Harold confided in his brother, Al Gentry, that all was not well in his marriage. These weren't the casual complaints of a man experiencing typical marital problems. These were the desperate words of a victim who sensed something sinister but couldn't quite identify the source of his fear. Harold was living with a predator who had marked him for death, and some primitive survival instinct was warning him that his life was in danger. The build-up to Harold's murder showcased Betty's evolution as a killer. She no longer needed to get her hands dirty with the actual killing. She had reached a level where she could orchestrate murders while maintaining perfect alibis. Betty was charged with arranging the murder of her fourth husband, Harold Gentry, who died in 1986. This wasn't just murder, this was murder by proxy, carried out by hired killers while she positioned herself as the innocent, unsuspecting wife. The selection of Harold as her fourth victim wasn't random. He possessed all the characteristics Betty looked for in her targets. He was financially stable, emotionally vulnerable, and completely trusting of his wife's devotion. Harold had no idea that his financial worth had been calculated down to the penny, that his insurance policies had been reviewed and found satisfactory, and that his death had been scheduled to occur at the most profitable possible moment. Betty's approach to the Gentry murder demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of how criminal investigations work. She knew that hiring someone else to commit the actual killing would create layers of separation between herself and the crime. She understood that maintaining physical distance from the murder scene would strengthen her alibi. and she recognized that playing the role of the shocked, grieving widow would be far more convincing if she genuinely hadn't pulled the trigger herself. The planning phase of Harold's murder was extensive and meticulous. Betty spent months, possibly years, setting up the circumstances that would lead to his death. She studied his routines, identified his vulnerabilities, and created opportunities for the killers she had hired to carry out their deadly mission. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a military-style operation planned with strategic precision and executed with ruthless efficiency. Betty collected about $20,000 in insurance money when Harold Gentry was killed. But the financial gain wasn't just about the immediate payout. It was about the accumulated wealth from her previous murders, the growing nest egg that represented the monetary value she had placed on human lives. Each murder had made her richer, and Harold's death was simply the next deposit in her blood money bank account. The actual murder of Harold Gentry was carried out with the same cold efficiency that characterized all of Betty's kills. The hired killers struck at a time and place that maximized Betty's alibi while ensuring minimal witnesses to the crime. The scene was crafted to suggest random violence or robbery gone wrong, anything that would direct suspicion away from the grieving widow who stood to benefit financially from her husband's death. In the immediate aftermath of Harold's murder, Betty's performance as the devastated widow was flawless. She wept at appropriate moments, accepted condolences gracefully, and organized a funeral that celebrated Harold's life while cementing her image as the innocent victim of random tragedy. The community rallied around her, offering support and sympathy to a woman they saw as having lost everything, never suspecting that she had actually gained exactly what she had planned to acquire through her husband's death. But Harold Gentry's murder would prove to be different from Betty's previous kills in one crucial way. His brother Al refused to let the case die along with Harold. Al Gentry had, for 22 years prior to Mrs. Newmer's arrest in 2007, urged police to investigate his death. Al's persistent demands for justice would eventually prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel Betty's entire web of murder and deception. Al Gentry's instincts told him that his brother's death wasn't random violence. It was targeted murder. He recognized patterns that the initial investigators had missed or ignored. He saw financial motivations that had been overlooked. And most importantly, he never stopped believing that Betty Newmer was responsible for his brother's death, even when everyone else seemed willing to accept the official version of events. The years following Harold's murder were crucial in understanding Betty's psychology as a serial killer. She had successfully orchestrated 4 murders and collected on multiple insurance policies, all while maintaining her reputation as a victim rather than a perpetrator. This level of success had made her overconfident, convinced that she was untouchable and that her methods were foolproof. Betty's mistake wasn't in the execution of Harold's murder. It was in underestimating the determination of Al Gentry to seek justice for his brother. She had calculated every aspect of the crime except the possibility that someone would refuse to accept the official narrative and would continue investigating long after the case had been officially closed. It took authorities 22 years to put it together, but eventually the evidence that Al Gentry had been accumulating would prove sufficient to bring charges against Betty. The murder of Harold Gentry, which had seemed like another perfect crime in Betty's murderous career, would ultimately become the case that exposed her as one of America's most prolific and calculating serial killers. The web of lies and deception that Betty had woven around Harold's murder was intricate and convincing, but it wasn't impenetrable. And when that web finally began to unravel, it would reveal not just the truth about Harold Gentry's death, but the horrifying scope of a killing spree that had claimed multiple victims across multiple decades. 22 years. That's how long it took for justice to finally catch up with Betty Newmer. And by 2008, authorities finally had enough evidence to charge her with hiring a hitman to murder Harold Gentry. But for a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of murder, even arrest wouldn't mark the end of her story. It would merely be another challenge to overcome through manipulation, delay tactics, and the same calculating intelligence she had used to kill her husbands. The investigation that finally brought Betty to justice was a testament to the persistence of Al Gentry and the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to let a cold case remain cold forever. As investigators began piecing together the evidence surrounding Harold's death, they uncovered a pattern so disturbing and comprehensive that it challenged their understanding of what a single person could be capable of accomplishing. Betty's arrest in the Gentry case prompted investigators in other states to look into the deaths of her 5 husbands. All are dead, and 3 died of gunshot wounds. The scope of the investigation expanded beyond Harold's murder as authorities realized they were dealing with a serial killer whose crimes had spanned multiple decades and multiple states. Each jurisdiction began reviewing the deaths that had occurred within their boundaries, searching for the common thread that connected them all: Betty Neumer. The evidence that emerged during the investigation painted a picture of a woman whose entire adult life had been dedicated to the systematic murder of her husbands. Financial records revealed the insurance payouts that had followed each death. Witness statements uncovered Betty's suspicious behavior before and after each murder. And most damning of all, investigators discovered evidence of Betty's connections to the people she had hired to carry out her murderous plans. Betty was free on $300,000 bond on 3 counts of solicitation to commit first-degree murder in the 1986 death of her 4th husband, Harold Gentry. Even facing these serious charges, Betty remained defiant, confident that she could manipulate the legal system just as successfully as she had manipulated her victims. Her behavior during this period revealed the depth of her psychopathy. She showed no remorse for her crimes, no empathy for her victims, and no recognition that her actions had caused immeasurable pain and suffering. The legal proceedings that followed Betty's arrest were marked by delay after delay, postponement after postponement. Her trial was postponed numerous times since her arrest in 2008. These delays weren't accidental. They were part of a calculated strategy to avoid justice for as long as possible. Betty understood that time was her enemy. The longer she could postpone her trial, the more likely it became that witnesses would die, evidence would be lost, and memories would fade. But even as the legal system struggled to bring Betty to trial, investigators were building an increasingly damning case against her. They had uncovered not just evidence of Harold's murder, but indications that Betty's criminal career was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. The woman who had appeared to be unlucky in love was revealed to be a calculating predator who had turned marriage into a profit-making enterprise built on murder. Police ruled her son's death a suicide, but Neumer was the beneficiary on her son's life insurance policy, even though he was married with children. This revelation added another dimension to Betty's crimes, suggesting that her willingness to kill for profit extended beyond her husband's to include her own family members. The discovery that she had profited from her son's death, while he left behind a wife and children, revealed the complete absence of maternal instinct or human decency in her psychological makeup. The pattern that emerged from the investigation was chilling in its consistency. Betty would marry a man, gradually isolate him from his support network, arrange for his death at the most financially advantageous moment, collect the insurance money, and then move on to her next victim. Each marriage was essentially a business transaction where love was the currency used to purchase trust, and trust was the weapon used to commit murder. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged about Betty's methods and motivations. She hadn't just killed for money. She had killed for the psychological satisfaction of proving she could manipulate and destroy the men who trusted her completely. The murders weren't just financial crimes. They were acts of profound psychological sadism carried out by a woman who derived pleasure from the ultimate betrayal of trust. The community that had once rallied around Betty as a victim began to understand the horrifying truth about the woman they had sympathized with and supported. The grieving widow they had comforted was revealed to be the architect of her husband's deaths. The woman they had seen as unlucky in love was exposed as a predator who had used love as a weapon to commit the most intimate form of murder imaginable. But justice, which had been delayed for more than 2 decades, would ultimately be denied entirely. Betty LaFawn Neumer died on June 13, 2011, taking her secrets to the grave and leaving her victims' families without the satisfaction of seeing her face trial for her crimes. Her death came just as investigators were preparing to present their evidence in court, robbing the justice system of the opportunity to hold her accountable for decades of murder and manipulation. Harold Gentry's brother, Al, said, "I think I've been cheated out of justice," when Betty died before her trial could begin. His words captured the frustration of everyone who had worked to bring her to justice, everyone who had been victimized by her crimes, and everyone who had hoped to see her finally pay for the lives she had taken. The death of Betty Newmer marked the end of one of America's most disturbing criminal careers, but it also left countless questions unanswered. How many people had she actually killed? Were there other victims whose deaths had never been connected to her? Had there been accomplices who helped her carry out her crimes? These questions would never be answered, buried along with Betty in her grave. Those other investigations did not produce charges, meaning that Betty would never be held accountable for the full scope of her crimes. The legal system that had struggled for years to build a case against her was ultimately cheated of the opportunity to deliver justice for all her victims. The legacy of Betty Newmer extends far beyond the individual lives she destroyed. Her case exposed weaknesses in the system that allowed a serial killer to operate undetected for decades. It demonstrated how easy it could be for a manipulative predator to exploit trust, love, and the legal system to commit murder with impunity. And it served as a chilling reminder that evil often comes disguised as innocence, that monsters can hide behind the faces of those we trust most completely. The Black Widow's web had finally been torn apart, but the spider herself had escaped justice through the ultimate evasion: death. Her victims remained dead, their families remained devastated, and their killer remained unpunished. In the end, Betty Newmer had gotten away with murder, not through cleverness or manipulation, but through the simple biological fact that even serial killers are mortal. The story of Betty Newmer stands as a testament to the devastating consequences of unchecked evil and the importance of never giving up the pursuit of justice, even when that pursuit takes decades to reach its conclusion. Though she escaped earthly justice, her story serves as a warning about the predators who walk among us, wearing the masks of those we love, trust, and marry. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Black Widow's Deadly Web, the Stacey Castor story. The amber liquid swirled innocently in the glass, golden, sweet, and lethal. What appeared to be an ordinary drink held within it the power to stop a human heart, dissolve internal organs, and transform a loving wife into one of America's most chilling serial killers. Stacey Castor didn't use guns or knives. She wielded chemistry as her weapon, turning everyday household items into instruments of death. This is the bone-chilling account of a woman who murdered her way through 2 marriages, poisoned her own daughter, and nearly escaped justice by weaving a web of deception so intricate that even seasoned investigators struggled to untangle her lies. When the truth finally emerged from the shadows of suburban New York, it revealed a predator so calculating, so merciless, that the judge who sentenced her declared she belonged to a class all by herself. The morning of January 11th, 2000, began like any other winter day in Liverpool, New York, but by its end, death would claim its first victim in what would become a decade-long killing spree orchestrated by a seemingly devoted wife and mother. Michael Wallace was only 48 years old when his life was brutally cut short, though at the time, no one suspected the woman sleeping beside him had authored his demise. The man who had worked tirelessly to provide for his family, laboring in demanding construction jobs, his hands permanently stained with the grit of honest work, collapsed without warning. His body convulsed violently as his internal organs began shutting down, one by one, in a process so agonizing that medical professionals later described it as one of the most torturous ways to die. Stacey Castor played her part to perfection. She wailed with grief, clutched his lifeless form, and begged the paramedics to save her beloved husband. Her performance was so convincing, so authentic in its desperation, that not a single person questioned her innocence. The doctors, faced with a seemingly healthy man who had suddenly expired, concluded that Michael's heart had simply given out, a tragic but natural occurrence that claimed thousands of middle-aged men each year. But Michael Wallace hadn't died of natural causes. As his body fought its final battle, ethylene glycol, the active component in antifreeze, was systematically destroying him from within. This toxic chemical, sweet to the taste and easily masked in food or drink, attacks the body with methodical brutality. First, It creates a false sense of intoxication, making victims appear drunk and disoriented. Then, as the poison metabolizes, it transforms into oxalic acid, which crystallizes in the kidneys, slicing through delicate tissue like microscopic glass shards. Michael's death was no accident, no twist of fate, no genetic predisposition to heart failure. It was cold-blooded murder, executed with such calculated precision that it would take investigators 7 years to uncover the truth. Stacy Castor had committed the perfect crime, or so she believed. The grieving widow wasted no time in collecting her husband's life insurance benefits, a sum that provided her with financial comfort and the resources to begin planning her next move. She displayed all the appropriate signs of mourning, attending grief counseling sessions and speaking tearfully about the challenges of raising 2 daughters alone. Friends and neighbors rallied around her, offering support and admiration for her strength during such a devastating time. What none of them realized was that they were witnessing a master manipulator at work. Stacy Castor possessed an almost supernatural ability to deceive, to present herself as whatever her audience needed her to be. She could summon tears on command, craft believable lies with breathtaking ease, and maintain multiple facades simultaneously without ever breaking character. During this period, she began developing the skills that would serve her so well in future murders. She researched poisons with the dedication of a doctoral student, learning about detection methods, lethal dosages, and the symptoms various toxins produced. She studied the investigative process, discovering how medical examiners determined cause of death and what red flags might trigger suspicion. Most importantly, she perfected her ability to appear utterly innocent while harboring the darkest of intentions. Michael's family harbored suspicions from the beginning. His sister, in particular, found Stacy's behavior suspicious and pushed for an autopsy. But Stacy refused, claiming that the doctors had already determined the cause of death and that further examination would be disrespectful to Michael's memory. She wielded her grief like a shield, making anyone who questioned her appear heartless and cruel. The truth was far more sinister. Stacy knew that an autopsy would reveal traces of ethylene glycol in Michael's system, exposing her crime and sending her to prison for life. By blocking the examination, she bought herself time and freedom. Time she would use to plan her next murder, and freedom that would cost another innocent man his life. As the months passed, Stacy's performance never wavered. She attended church regularly, volunteered at her daughter's school, and maintained the image of a devoted single mother struggling to rebuild her life. She spoke frequently about Michael's memory, sharing touching stories about their marriage and expressing gratitude for the time they'd shared together. It was a masterclass in deception, and everyone fell for it completely. Behind closed doors, however, a different Stacy emerged. She began dating again with surprising speed, though she was careful to appear reluctant and emotional about moving on. She claimed that Michael wouldn't want her to remain alone forever, that he would encourage her to find happiness again. It was a calculated move designed to explain her romantic pursuits while maintaining her image as a loving, devoted widow. The psychological profile of a killer like Stacy Castor reveals a mind capable of compartmentalizing emotions in ways that normal people cannot comprehend. She could genuinely mourn certain aspects of her loss: the financial security, the social status of being married, the practical benefits of having a partner, while feeling no remorse whatsoever for the act of murder itself. In her twisted psychology, Michael's death wasn't a tragedy. It was a necessary step in her personal evolution. What made Stacy particularly dangerous was her ability to learn from experience and adapt her methods. Michael's death had gone undetected, but she recognized areas for improvement. She began studying different poisons, considering various scenarios, and identifying potential future victims. Murder, for Stacy Castor, had become not just a means to an end, but a craft to be perfected. The community that embraced her, the family that supported her, and the daughters who looked to her for guidance had no idea they were living alongside a remorseless killer. Stacy Castor had successfully convinced the world that she was a victim of circumstance, when in reality, she was a predator patiently stalking her next prey. As she tucked her daughters into bed each night, kissed them goodnight, and whispered words of love and comfort, Stacy was simultaneously plotting the death of the next man who would have the misfortune of falling in love with her. The Black Widow had tasted blood, and she was far from finished with her deadly work. 3 years after Michael Wallace's mysterious death, Stacy Castor encountered the man who would become her second victim. Though David Castor had no way of knowing that accepting her invitation for coffee would ultimately seal his fate. David was everything a widow could ask for in a second chance at love. Kind-hearted, financially stable, and desperately eager to provide a father figure for Stacy's 2 daughters. At 57, he had never been married and possessed the gentle nature of someone who had spent years hoping for a family of his own. His construction business was thriving, his bank accounts were healthy, and his heart was wide open to the possibility of love in his later years. For Stacy, David Castor represented the perfect target. He was older, established, and completely infatuated with her. More importantly, he was naive about women like her, predators who could mimic genuine affection with terrifying accuracy. David saw in Stacy a beautiful, vulnerable woman who had suffered tremendous loss and needed protection. He wanted to be her hero, her savior, her second chance at happiness. Their courtship unfolded like a fairy tale, at least on the surface. David showered Stacy with gifts, romantic dinners, and promises of security. He spoke openly about wanting to adopt her daughters, to give them the stable home life they deserved. He purchased life insurance policies, updated his will to include his new family, and spoke excitedly about their future together. Every gesture of love and commitment brought him one step closer to his own destruction. Stacy played her role flawlessly, appearing grateful but not desperate, loving but not clingy. She allowed David to court her slowly, making him work for her affection in ways that only increased his devotion. She spoke tearfully about her fears of loving again, about the pain of loss, and about her determination to protect her daughters from further heartbreak. David interpreted her caution as evidence of her deep emotional capacity, never suspecting it was actually the careful calculation of a serial killer. They married in a ceremony that friends described as touching and authentic. David beamed with pride as he promised to love and cherish Stacy for the rest of his life, a vow that would prove tragically prophetic. Stacy, radiant in white, pledged her loyalty and devotion with the same convincing sincerity she had displayed throughout their relationship. The wedding photos captured a moment of apparent joy and hope, though they would later serve as chilling evidence of a killer's ability to deceive. The early months of their marriage appeared blissful to outside observers. David treated Stacy's daughters as his own, attending school events and helping with homework. He renovated their home, planned family vacations, and spoke constantly about his gratitude for finally finding true love. Friends noted how happy he seemed, how fulfilled and complete. They had no idea they were witnessing a man being systematically prepared for slaughter. Stacy, meanwhile, was conducting her own research into her husband's financial situation, learning the details of his insurance policies and familiarizing herself with his daily routines. She discovered that David's construction business was worth substantial money, that his life insurance would provide her with financial security for years, and that his will left everything to her and the girls. From her perspective, David Castor had become a walking bank account, one that would be worth far more dead than alive. The psychological manipulation began subtly. Stacy started suggesting that David looked tired, that he seemed stressed, that perhaps he was working too hard. She encouraged him to slow down, to delegate responsibilities, to trust her judgment about his health. She positioned herself as the caring wife who was concerned about his well-being, when in reality, she was setting the stage for murder. David, completely devoted to his new family, began spending more time at home. This gave Stacy greater access to his food and drinks, more opportunities to observe his habits, and increased privacy to plan his demise. She studied his preferences, noting that he enjoyed certain beverages and rarely questioned anything she prepared for him. His trust in her was absolute and would prove to be fatal. During this period, Stacy also began establishing her alibi for the future. She spoke to friends about David's supposed health concerns, mentioned his occasional complaints of fatigue, and suggested that the stress of running a business was taking its toll. She was creating a narrative that would later support the conclusion that David had died by his own hand, depressed, overwhelmed, and unable to cope with life's pressures. The selection of antifreeze as her weapon was deliberate and strategic. Stacy had learned from Michael's death that ethylene glycol poisoning could mimic other conditions, that it was difficult to detect without specific testing, and that it produced symptoms consistent with various natural causes of death. She also knew that antifreeze was readily available, that its sweet taste made it easy to disguise in drinks, and that its presence in a home could be easily explained as automotive maintenance. What made Stacy's method particularly cruel was the prolonged suffering it inflicted. Antifreeze poisoning doesn't kill quickly or painlessly. Instead, it subjects victims to hours or even days of agony as their bodies shut down system by system. David would experience confusion, nausea, difficulty breathing, and organ failure, all while Stacy maintained her facade of loving concern. As David's second anniversary approached, Stacy had already made her decision. The man who had opened his heart and home to her, who had loved her daughters as his own, who had trusted her with his life and fortune, was about to become the victim of the most heinous betrayal imaginable. David Castor went to sleep on August 21, 2005, believing himself to be a fortunate man. He had a beautiful wife who loved him, 2 daughters who brought him joy, and a future full of promise. He had no way of knowing that the woman lying beside him had already decided that he was worth more dead than alive, or that she had spent months planning the most agonizing death she could devise. The stage was set for the second act in Stacy Castor's theater of death, and her leading man had no idea that the curtain was about to fall on his life forever. The final weekend of David Castor's life began with the ordinary rhythms of suburban domesticity, but it would end with a murder so coldly calculated that investigators would later marvel at the killer's complete absence of human conscience. Saturday morning, August 20th, 2005, found David Castor in his workshop, tinkering with a project that had occupied his attention for weeks. He was a man who found peace in working with his hands, in the methodical process of creation and repair. Stacy watched him from the kitchen window, observing his movements with the focused attention of a predator studying her prey. Today, she had decided, would be his last. The weapon of choice sat innocuously in the garage, a gallon container of antifreeze, its bright green contents as deadly as any poison ever devised. Stacy had researched the lethal dose meticulously, calculating David's body weight and determining exactly how much ethylene glycol would be required to ensure his death. She had practiced mixing the substance with various liquids, testing which combinations best masked its taste and which delivery methods would be most effective. David's routine was predictable, a fact that Stacy had noted with professional interest. He would work in his shop until early afternoon, then come inside for lunch and a cold drink. He preferred certain beverages, consumed them at a consistent pace, and rarely questioned anything his loving wife prepared for him. His trust in Stacy was absolute, and it would prove to be fatal. The afternoon heat was oppressive, creating the perfect conditions for Stacy's plan. David would be thirsty when he came inside, eager for something cold and refreshing. She prepared his drink with the care of a pharmacist measuring medication, combining the antifreeze with his favorite beverage in proportions designed to deliver a lethal dose while minimizing the chances of detection. Ethylene glycol, the active ingredient in antifreeze, is particularly insidious because its initial effects mimic alcohol intoxication. Victims become drowsy, confused, and unsteady, symptoms that can easily be attributed to fatigue, illness, or other benign causes. By the time the poison begins its devastating assault on the internal organs, it's often too late for medical intervention. When David entered the house, sweaty and tired from his work, Stacy greeted him with the warm smile that had first captivated his heart. She had prepared lunch, she announced, and poured him a tall, cold drink to help him cool down. David accepted both gratefully, kissing his wife's cheek and commenting on her thoughtfulness. He had no idea he was consuming his own death warrant. The poison worked exactly as Stacy had anticipated. Within an hour, David began complaining of fatigue and dizziness. Stacy expressed appropriate concern, suggesting that perhaps he had overexerted himself in the heat. She encouraged him to rest, to drink more fluids, to let her take care of him. Her performance was flawless, the devoted wife ministering to her husband's mysterious illness. As the afternoon progressed, David's condition deteriorated rapidly. The ethylene glycol was beginning its systematic destruction of his kidneys, liver, and central nervous system. He experienced nausea, confusion, and difficulty breathing. Stacy remained by his side, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort, all while carefully monitoring his decline and calculating how much longer the process would take. The true horror of Stacy's crime lay not just in the murder itself, but in her complete emotional detachment from David's suffering. She watched the man who loved her dying in agony, listened to his labored breathing and confused pleas for help, and felt nothing but satisfaction at the success of her plan. The psychological capacity for such coldness defies normal human understanding. By Sunday morning, David was barely conscious. His breathing was shallow and irregular. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his body was shutting down system by system. Stacy knew that death was imminent, and she began preparing for the performance that would follow. She rehearsed her grief, practiced her shock and horror, and prepared the narrative she would present to the paramedics. The 911 call came at 12:23 p.m. on Sunday, August 21st, 2005. Stacy's voice, captured on the recording, conveyed exactly the right mixture of panic and desperation. "My husband," she cried to the dispatcher. "Something's wrong with my husband. Please send an ambulance." Her performance was so convincing that the emergency operator never questioned whether this might be anything other than a medical emergency. When paramedics arrived at the Castor home, they found David unconscious in his bed, his body already showing signs of organ failure. Stacy provided them with a carefully constructed account of his symptoms, describing how he had seemed tired and unwell since Saturday afternoon, how she had encouraged him to rest, and how she had discovered him unresponsive that morning. Her story was plausible, consistent, and completely false. David Castor was pronounced dead at Auburn Community Hospital at 2:30 p.m. The cause of death was initially listed as undetermined pending autopsy results, but medical personnel suspected either a heart attack or stroke. No one considered the possibility of poisoning. The symptoms David had exhibited could easily be attributed to various natural causes, and his wife's grief appeared genuine and overwhelming. Stacy's performance at the hospital was masterful. She wept openly, demanded answers from the doctors, and expressed disbelief that her healthy husband could die so suddenly. She spoke movingly about their love for each other, their plans for the future, and her devastation at losing another husband so young. Hospital staff were moved by her obvious pain and offered their condolences and support. The autopsy revealed traces of ethylene glycol in David's system, but the levels were not initially considered suspicious. Antifreeze poisoning can be accidental. People sometimes consume it by mistake or use it as a suicide method. The medical examiner noted the presence of the substance but concluded that David had likely ingested it deliberately, taking his own life in a moment of despair. This conclusion suited Stacy perfectly. A suicide ruling would eliminate any investigation into her possible involvement, while also providing a psychological explanation for David's death that portrayed him as mentally unstable. She embraced this narrative eagerly, speaking to friends and family about the supposed warning signs she had missed, the depression she claimed David had hidden from everyone. The insurance companies accepted the suicide ruling and processed Stacy's claims without question. She collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in life insurance benefits, inherited David's construction business, and gained access to all his assets. From a financial perspective, the murder had been enormously successful, but Stacy Castor had made a critical error in judgment. She had become overconfident, believing herself to be so skilled at deception that she could commit murder with impunity. This arrogance would prove to be her downfall, leading her to take increasingly reckless actions that would eventually expose her crimes to the world. As she stood beside David's grave at his funeral, accepting condolences from friends and family, Stacy Castor appeared to be a twice-widowed woman destroyed by cruel fate. In reality, she was a remorseless serial killer who had successfully eliminated her second victim and was already considering who might be next. The Black Widow had claimed another victim, but her web of deception was beginning to show signs of strain. 2 years after David Castor's death, Stacy had successfully collected his insurance money, liquidated his business assets, and established herself as a grieving widow deserving of sympathy and support. But her carefully constructed world was about to collapse when investigators began connecting dots that would expose her as one of America's most ruthless serial killers. The first crack in her facade appeared when Cayuga County authorities decided to exhume Michael Wallace's body. His sister had never stopped pressing for answers, never stopped questioning the circumstances of his sudden death, and never stopped suspecting that Stacy knew more than she was revealing. 7 years after Michael's burial, the truth was finally going to emerge from his grave. The exhumation took place on a cold morning in 2007, with forensic specialists carefully extracting Michael's remains for the autopsy that should have been performed years earlier. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and confirmed the darkest suspicions about Stacy Castor's true nature. Michael Wallace's tissue samples revealed massive concentrations of ethylene glycol, levels so high that there was no possibility of accidental ingestion or natural occurrence. He had been deliberately poisoned with antifreeze, murdered by someone with intimate access to his food and drink. The method was identical to David Castor's death, creating an unmistakable pattern that pointed directly to the one person both men had trusted completely: their wife. When investigators confronted Stacy with this evidence, she initially maintained her innocence with the same convincing sincerity that had fooled everyone for so long. She expressed shock at the findings, suggested that perhaps someone else had been responsible, and even implied that her daughters might have information she didn't possess. It was a desperate performance, but one that revealed the depths of her depravity. She was willing to implicate her own children to save herself. Stacy knew that her arrest was inevitable. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and investigators were building an airtight case that would send her to prison for life. In the twisted logic of a sociopathic mind, she decided that if she was going down, she wouldn't go down alone. Her own daughter, Ashley Wallace, was about to become the target of the most heinous betrayal any parent could commit. Ashley was 20 years old, a college student with her whole life ahead of her. She loved her mother deeply, despite growing suspicions about the circumstances surrounding her stepfather's deaths. She had defended Stacy against family members who questioned her story, stood by her through the investigations, and provided emotional support during the most challenging periods. Ashley's loyalty to her mother was absolute, and Stacy was about to repay that devotion with attempted murder. The plan Stacy devised was diabolically clever. She would poison Ashley with a combination of alcohol and prescription medications, making it appear that the young woman had committed suicide out of guilt for murdering both of her stepfathers. She would forge a suicide note confessing to the crimes, thereby exonerating herself while eliminating the one person who might eventually remember incriminating details from their shared past. On September 13, 2007, Stacy invited Ashley home from college under the pretense of needing emotional support during the ongoing investigation. Ashley, concerned about her mother's mental state, agreed to spend the night at home. She had no idea that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated death trap. Stacy prepared the toxic mixture with the same methodical precision she had used to murder her husbands. She combined vodka with crushed prescription medications, antidepressants, and painkillers that would prove fatal when consumed in large quantities. The alcohol would mask the taste of the pills and accelerate their absorption into Ashley's system. The conversation that evening was carefully orchestrated by Stacy to create the psychological foundation for her plan. She spoke about feeling overwhelmed by suspicion, about wondering if the police were right to investigate the deaths, about her fears that someone close to the family might be responsible. She encouraged Ashley to drink, claiming that alcohol helped her cope with stress and suggesting that they both deserved to escape their problems temporarily. Ashley, trusting her mother completely, consumed the poisoned drinks without suspicion. She began feeling dizzy and confused, symptoms that Stacy attributed to the emotional strain of recent events. As Ashley's condition deteriorated, Stacy guided her to the bedroom, helping her lie down and expressing concern about her daughter's well-being. The poison worked rapidly. Ashley lost consciousness as her body struggled to process the toxic combination of alcohol and medications. Her breathing became shallow, her heart rate dropped dangerously low, and her organs began shutting down. She was dying, and her own mother was watching with cold satisfaction. While Ashley lay unconscious and dying, Stacy completed the final element of her plan, the forged suicide note. Written in handwriting designed to resemble Ashley's, the note confessed to murdering both Michael Wallace and David Castor. It described overwhelming guilt, inability to live with the secret any longer, and a desire to end the pain through suicide. The note was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, designed to convince investigators that Ashley was the true killer. Stacy's plan began to unravel when Ashley survived the poisoning attempt. Her body, younger and stronger than those of the men Stacy had successfully murdered, managed to fight off the toxic assault long enough for medical intervention. When Stacy realized that Ashley was still breathing, still clinging to life, she made the 911 call that would ultimately lead to her downfall. "My daughter's tried to kill herself," Stacy screamed into the phone, her voice conveying perfectly performed panic and desperation. She described finding Ashley unconscious, discovering the supposed suicide note, and begging for immediate medical assistance. To the emergency operator, it sounded like a genuine crisis. A mother discovering her daughter's suicide attempt. Paramedics rushed Ashley to the hospital, where emergency room physicians began the fight to save her life. The young woman was in critical condition, her body overwhelmed by the toxic cocktail her mother had forced her to consume. For hours, medical personnel worked desperately to stabilize her condition and prevent organ failure. As Ashley lay fighting for her life, Stacy maintained her performance of the devastated mother. She paced the hospital corridors, wept openly, and spoke to anyone who would listen about her daughter's supposed guilt and depression. She showed the forged suicide note to investigators, explaining that it revealed the truth about both deaths and proved that Ashley, not she, was the real killer. But Ashley Wallace was stronger than her mother had anticipated, and she possessed something that Stacy lacked entirely: a conscience. When Ashley regained consciousness and learned about the forged confession, she immediately told investigators the truth about that night. She described her mother encouraging her to drink, her gradual loss of consciousness, and her growing suspicions about her mother's involvement in both deaths. Ashley's testimony provided investigators with the final piece of evidence they needed to arrest Stacy Castor. The woman who had successfully murdered 2 husbands and nearly killed her own daughter was finally going to face justice for her crimes. The arrest took place on September 14, 2007, just one day after Ashley's near-death experience. Stacy was charged with second-degree murder for David Castor's death, attempted murder for the poisoning of Ashley, and conspiracy to commit murder regarding Michael Wallace's case. The charges carried the potential for life in prison without parole. Even as the handcuffs closed around her wrists, Stacy continued protesting her innocence. She claimed that Ashley was lying, that the evidence had been planted, that she was the victim of a conspiracy designed to frame her for crimes she hadn't committed. Her performance was less convincing now, desperation replacing the smooth confidence that had served her so well in the past. The trial of Stacy Castor became a media sensation, with reporters dubbing her the Black Widow and describing her crimes as among the most cold-blooded in American history. The evidence presented was overwhelming: forensic proof of poisoning, testimony about her suspicious behavior, and the damning testimony of her own daughter. On February 5, 2009, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury found Stacy Castor guilty on all charges. The judge, in sentencing her to 51 years to life in prison, made a statement that perfectly captured the horror of her crimes. "Mrs. Castor, you are in a class all by yourself. In the annals of true crime, it takes a lot to stick out." But as the judge who sentenced her to over 50 years in prison said, "Mrs. Castor, you are in a class all by yourself." Stacy Castor died in prison on June 11, 2016, at the age of 48. David Castor's death at 48 in August 2005 was initially considered a suicide, but investigators later determined he didn't knowingly drink ethylene glycol, a toxic chemical found in antifreeze. She never showed remorse for her crimes, never acknowledged the pain she had caused, and never explained why she chose to become a killer rather than simply seek divorce from unwanted husbands. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear the most innocent of faces, that trust can be weaponized by those without conscience, and that the capacity for human cruelty knows no bounds. The Black Widow's web had finally collapsed, but the destruction she left in her wake would haunt her surviving family members for the rest of their lives. Ashley Wallace, the daughter who survived her mother's ultimate betrayal, has worked to rebuild her life while carrying the burden of knowing that the woman who gave her life also tried to take it away. Her courage in testifying against her mother helped ensure that justice was finally served, bringing an end to one of America's most disturbing cases of domestic murder. The antifreeze killer was no more, but her legacy of death and deception would serve as a cautionary tale for generations to come. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our fourth story. Story 4. The Black Widow of Kyoto, Chisako Kakihi's Trail of Death. Death followed her like a shadow, creeping through wedding chapels and nursing homes, leaving behind a graveyard of lovers who dared to trust her smile. While most women her age tended gardens and grandchildren, 70-year-old Chisako Kakihi cultivated something far more sinister, a methodical harvest of human lives that would earn her one of the most chilling titles in criminal history. This is the story of Japan's most notorious serial killer, a grandmother whose weapon of choice wasn't a blade or bullet, but something far more insidious. Cyanide crystals that dissolved as easily as sugar in tea, and a black heart that beat with the rhythm of pure evil. Between 2007 and 2013, 6 men would fall victim to her deadly embrace. Each one believed they had found love in their twilight years. Each one was catastrophically wrong. What they discovered instead was a predator who had perfected the art of murder, transforming intimate moments into death scenes with the precision of a surgeon and the conscience of a demon. The fluorescent lights of the Kyoto courthouse cast harsh shadows across Chisako Kakihi's weathered face as she sat motionless, her hands folded with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to hiding their true nature. To the untrained eye, she appeared as nothing more than a frail grandmother, her silver hair meticulously styled, her dark eyes holding what might have passed for sorrow. But those who had studied her case knew better. They recognized the calculating intelligence that lurked behind that deceptively innocent facade, the mind of a killer who had turned romance into a weapon and matrimony into murder. Born in 1946 in the ancient city of Kyoto, Chisako grew up during Japan's post-war reconstruction, a time when traditional values battled against rapid modernization. Her childhood, by all accounts, seemed unremarkable, the daughter of working-class parents who struggled to rebuild their lives from the ashes of defeat. Yet somewhere in those formative years, something fundamental went wrong. Perhaps it was the deprivation, the constant struggle for survival, or something darker that festered in the depths of her developing psyche. Whatever the catalyst, it planted the seeds of what would eventually blossom into an insatiable appetite for death. Her first marriage came young, as was expected of women in 1960s Japan. She bore children, played the role of dutiful wife, and seemed to settle into the prescribed pattern of domestic life. But even then, there were whispers, subtle anomalies that would only make sense decades later when viewed through the lens of her crimes. Her first husband died unexpectedly in 1994, the cause attributed to natural causes. The grief she displayed seemed genuine, her tears flowing freely at his funeral. No one suspected that this mourning widow was already beginning to perfect her craft. The years that followed revealed a disturbing pattern. Chisako seemed to possess an unusual magnetism when it came to attracting older, wealthy men. She had an uncanny ability to present herself as the perfect companion, vulnerable enough to inspire protectiveness, yet independent enough to seem desirable. Her conversations were peppered with just the right amount of flattery, her laughter timed to perfection, her touch calculated to suggest intimacy without seeming forward. She was, in essence, a master manipulator who had weaponized femininity itself. By the early 2000s, She had begun frequenting places where lonely, affluent seniors gathered, community centers, religious organizations, and specialized dating services for the elderly. Her hunting grounds were carefully chosen, locations where desperation and hope intersected, where men who had lost spouses or never found lasting love would be most susceptible to her carefully crafted persona. She understood their needs intimately: the hunger for companionship, the fear of dying alone, the desire to feel wanted and desired despite advancing age. Her method was always the same: a slow courtship that began with innocent conversation and gradually escalated to deeper emotional intimacy. She would listen attentively to their stories, remember details about their lives, their fears, their dreams. She became whatever they needed her to be: the understanding confidant, the passionate lover, the devoted caregiver. And once she had thoroughly ensnared them, once they had opened their hearts and their bank accounts to her, she would begin planning their destruction. The transformation from grieving widow to calculating killer didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual metamorphosis, each successful manipulation building her confidence, each death teaching her valuable lessons about avoiding detection. She studied the effects of various substances, learning which ones mimicked natural causes of death and which ones left telltale traces. She observed the behavior of truly grieving relatives, noting the subtle differences between genuine sorrow and performed emotion. Most crucially, she developed an understanding of how investigators thought, what they looked for, and how to give them exactly what they expected to see. Cyanide became her signature, a compound so readily available that acquiring it raised no suspicions, so lethal that death came swiftly, and so cleverly deployed that it could be mistaken for heart failure or stroke in elderly victims. She learned to time the administration perfectly, ensuring that symptoms wouldn't manifest until she had established an alibi. She mastered the art of the grieving widow, her performances so convincing that she often received sympathy rather than suspicion. But perhaps most chilling of all was her complete lack of emotional response to the suffering she caused. While her victims writhed in agony, their bodies convulsing as the poison attacked their nervous systems, she remained calm, even helpful, calling for medical assistance with just the right note of panic in her voice. She held their hands as they died, whispering words of comfort while watching the life drain from their eyes. In those final moments, when her masks finally slipped away, her victims glimpsed the true monster that had seduced them, a creature devoid of empathy, mercy, or human feeling. The psychology behind her actions defied simple explanation. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation, but something far more disturbing: murder as a lifestyle, killing as a form of self-expression. Each death brought her not just financial gain, but a sense of power and control that seemed to feed something fundamental in her nature. She was addicted to the process: the hunt, the seduction, the betrayal, and ultimately the kill. Each victim validated her superiority, proved her ability to manipulate and destroy those who trusted her. As she sat in that courthouse, facing the weight of evidence that would finally bring her to justice, Chisako Kakihi remained largely unrepentant. Her lawyers would argue diminished capacity, claim that age and illness had clouded her judgment. But those who had studied her crimes knew the truth. This was no confused elderly woman acting impulsively. This was a predator who had spent years perfecting her technique, a killer who had turned love itself into a weapon of mass destruction. The stage was set for one of the most horrific serial killing sprees in Japanese history, a reign of terror that would claim 6 lives and destroy countless others. The Black Widow of Kyoto was about to begin her deadly dance, and the men who crossed her path would pay the ultimate price for their trust, their love, and their fatal underestimation of the evil that smiled back at them across candlelit dinner tables and whispered sweet promises in the darkness of their bedrooms. The methodical destruction of human life began with Masanori Honda, a 71-year-old man whose only crime was believing that love could bloom again in the autumn of his existence. Honda had spent his later years in quiet solitude after losing his wife to cancer, tending to his small garden and occasionally visiting the local community center where other widowers gathered to share stories and seek companionship. It was there, among the mundane conversations about grandchildren and health problems, that death first crossed his path in the form of Chisako Kakihi's disarming smile. Their courtship unfolded with the careful precision of a chess master maneuvering pieces toward checkmate. Kakihi presented herself as a woman wounded by loss but not broken by it, someone who understood the particular pain of outliving one's spouse. She spoke of her loneliness with just enough vulnerability to inspire Honda's protective instincts, while maintaining an independence that made her seem desirable rather than desperate. Their conversations meandered through shared memories of better times, complaints about ungrateful children, and dreams of peaceful companionship in their remaining years. Honda found himself captivated by this woman who seemed to genuinely listen to his stories, who laughed at his modest jokes and touched his arm with familiar affection. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of emotions he thought had died with his wife. He began to dress more carefully when he knew he might see her, to plan conversations that would hold her interest, to imagine a future that extended beyond his solitary existence. Kakihi's patience during this phase was remarkable, the patience of a spider allowing prey to become thoroughly entangled before striking. She allowed the relationship to develop naturally, never pushing too hard or moving too fast. She accepted his small gifts with genuine-seeming gratitude, allowed him to take her to modest restaurants where they could talk without interruption, and gradually permitted increasing intimacy. When he finally worked up the courage to propose, her acceptance seemed to transform him entirely. The wedding was a small affair, attended by his children who harbored quiet reservations about their father's sudden romance but couldn't argue with his obvious happiness. Photographs from the ceremony show Honda beaming with the joy of a man who had been given an unexpected second chance at love, while his bride smiled with what appeared to be genuine affection. No one present could have imagined they were witnessing the final chapter of his life. The poisoning began almost immediately after their honeymoon. Kakihi had chosen her method carefully. Small doses of cyanide administered over several weeks, creating symptoms that closely resembled the natural decline of an elderly man with underlying health issues. Honda began experiencing fatigue that he attributed to the excitement of newlywed life. His appetite decreased, which concerned his bride enough that she insisted on preparing all his meals personally. His breathing became occasionally labored, a symptom she suggested might be related to his smoking history. The genius of her approach lay in its gradual escalation. Rather than administering a lethal dose immediately, she allowed his body to be slowly poisoned while she established her role as the devoted caregiver. She accompanied him to doctor's appointments, describing his symptoms with the detailed concern of a loving wife. She researched his medical history, learning enough about his previous conditions to suggest plausible explanations for his declining health. When physicians ran standard tests, they found evidence consistent with cardiovascular disease and respiratory problems, exactly what they expected to see in a man of his age and medical history. Honda's final days were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. As his condition worsened, Kakihi became increasingly attentive, spending hours by his bedside, holding his hand as he struggled with breathing difficulties that she knew were caused by her poison. She spoke to him in soothing tones about their future together, about places they would visit when he recovered, about the happiness they would share in their remaining years. Her performance was so convincing that even his own children began to see her as a blessing in their father's life, a woman whose love had given him joy before his natural death. The final administration of poison came on a quiet evening in October 2007. Kakihi had prepared his favorite meal, adding a generous dose of cyanide to his tea while he watched television in the adjoining room. She called him to dinner with the same affectionate tone she had used throughout their brief marriage, watched him drink deeply from the cup that would kill him, and continued their conversation as if nothing had changed. The effects were swift but not immediate enough to suggest poisoning to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Honda complained of sudden chest pain, describing a crushing sensation that radiated down his left arm. Kakihi immediately called for emergency medical assistance, her voice carrying exactly the right note of panic and fear. She held him as he convulsed, his body fighting against the poison that was systematically shutting down his nervous system. His final words were an expression of gratitude for her love, a declaration of happiness that he had found her before the end. The emergency responders found exactly what they expected: an elderly man in cardiac arrest, his devoted wife beside herself with grief and concern. The subsequent investigation was perfunctory. Honda's age, medical history, and the apparent naturalness of his decline made foul play seem unlikely. The autopsy revealed evidence consistent with heart failure, and the case was closed without further inquiry. Kakihi's performance as a grieving widow was flawless. She sobbed at appropriate moments, shared touching memories of their brief time together, and expressed gratitude for the months of happiness he had given her. She spoke of him with apparent love and loss, painting a picture of a romance cut tragically short by fate rather than design. Even Honda's children, initially suspicious of their father's sudden marriage, found themselves comforting the woman they now believed had genuinely loved him. But the most chilling aspect of Honda's murder wasn't the method or the motive. It was the complete absence of remorse in his killer. While others mourned the loss of a kind man who had simply wanted companionship in his final years, Kakihi was already planning her next victim. Honda's death had proven the effectiveness of her method and the inadequacy of the investigative response. She had committed the perfect murder, and the intoxicating sense of power and control it gave her was already driving her toward her next kill. The inheritance from Honda's estate wasn't substantial, but it was enough to validate her approach and fund her continued predatory lifestyle. More importantly, his death had given her confidence in her ability to kill without detection, to manipulate not just her victims but the entire system designed to protect them. She had looked into the eyes of a dying man who trusted her completely, had held his hand as her poison destroyed his body, and had felt nothing but satisfaction at her own cleverness. Honda's murder established the template that would guide Kakihi's future crimes. The careful selection of vulnerable targets, the patient cultivation of romantic relationships, the gradual administration of poison disguised as natural decline, and the convincing performance of grief when the inevitable end arrived. But most crucially, it proved to her that she could kill with impunity, that the perfect crime wasn't just possible but surprisingly easy to accomplish. The Black Widow had tasted blood, and the hunger for more was already consuming her. Honda's death was not an ending but a beginning, the first movement in a symphony of destruction that would claim 5 more lives before justice finally caught up with her. Each subsequent victim would validate her methods while refining her technique, turning murder from an experiment into an art form that she would perfect over 6 years of calculated killing. The systematic elimination of human life had become Chisako Kakihi's consuming passion. Each murder a carefully orchestrated performance that left investigators convinced they were witnessing natural deaths rather than calculated homicides. Following Masanori Honda's demise, she had refined her technique to deadly perfection, transforming the act of killing from crude experimentation into a sophisticated art form that would claim 4 more lives over the next 5 years. Her second victim, Isao Kakihi, provided both a surname that would become synonymous with terror and a significantly larger inheritance that would fund her increasingly luxurious lifestyle. Isao was a successful businessman who had accumulated substantial wealth through decades of careful investment and shrewd decision-making. At 75, he was precisely the type of target Kakihi preferred, affluent, lonely, and desperately seeking companionship in his twilight years. The seduction of Isao Kakihi demonstrated how thoroughly she had learned from Honda's murder. This time, she approached the relationship with even greater patience and psychological sophistication. She studied his habits obsessively, learning about his business interests, his family dynamics, and most importantly, his fears about aging alone. She positioned herself not just as a potential romantic partner, but as someone who could provide the intellectual stimulation and emotional support he craved. Their courtship lasted nearly 2 years, during which time Kakihi gradually integrated herself into every aspect of his life. She accompanied him to business functions, where her charm and apparent devotion made them seem like the perfect couple to envious onlookers. She learned to discuss his investments with surprising insight, offering opinions that flattered his expertise while demonstrating her own intelligence. Most crucially, she began managing aspects of his household, ostensibly to help an aging man cope with daily responsibilities, but actually to gain access to his food and medication. The poisoning of Isao Kakihi began months before his actual death. A gradual campaign of chemical warfare waged across dinner tables and morning coffee cups. She had learned to vary her delivery methods, sometimes mixing cyanide compounds into his medications, other times dissolving them in beverages or incorporating them into meals. The dosages were carefully calculated to produce symptoms that would escalate gradually, mimicking the progression of various age-related diseases while avoiding the sudden onset that might trigger suspicion. Isao began experiencing what appeared to be early signs of dementia: memory lapses, confusion, difficulty concentrating. Kikihi responded to these symptoms with apparent concern, suggesting that they consult specialists and adjust his daily routines to compensate for his declining cognitive function. She documented his symptoms carefully, creating a medical record that would support the narrative of natural deterioration when investigators eventually reviewed his case. The psychological torture she inflicted was perhaps even more cruel than the physical poisoning. As Isao's condition worsened, she would frequently remind him of conversations he couldn't remember, point out mistakes in judgment that concerned him deeply, and suggest that his confusion might be hereditary. She undermined his confidence systematically while positioning herself as his sole source of stability and support in an increasingly bewildering world. The final phase of Isao's murder was executed with theatrical precision. Kikihi had planned the timing to coincide with a family gathering, ensuring that multiple witnesses would observe his final decline and her devoted care. She administered the fatal dose during the preparation of a special dinner she was hosting, mixing a concentrated solution of cyanide into his sake while other family members were distracted with meal preparations. The symptoms manifested exactly as she had predicted: sudden cardiac distress that appeared to be triggered by the excitement of family festivities. Isao collapsed during the meal, clutching his chest and gasping for breath while his wife knelt beside him, calling his name with apparent desperation. The family members present later testified to her obvious devotion and grief, describing how she had cradled his head in her lap while waiting for emergency responders to arrive. The death of Isao Kikihi brought her a substantial inheritance and, more importantly, validation that her methods had achieved true sophistication. The investigation was even more cursory than Honda's case, partly because the gradual onset of symptoms had created such a compelling narrative of natural decline, and partly because her performance as a grieving widow had become absolutely flawless. Her third victim, Masaki Hyoki, represented a departure from her previous pattern. At 66, he was younger than her typical targets, but his substantial savings and isolated lifestyle made him irresistible. Hyoki had never married, dedicating his life entirely to his career as an engineer before retiring to pursue hobbies that kept him largely solitary. His encounter with Kikihi came through a specialized dating service for mature adults, where she had carefully crafted a profile designed to appeal to men like him. The seduction of Hyoki required different tactics than her previous victims. Rather than exploiting the grief of widowerhood, she played upon his regret at having missed the opportunity for love and family. She presented herself as someone who understood the sacrifices demanded by career dedication while offering the possibility of experiencing domestic happiness in his remaining years. Their relationship developed through long conversations about life's missed opportunities and shared dreams of simple pleasures they had never allowed themselves to enjoy. Hyoki's murder was accomplished through a series of weekend getaways that Kikihi suggested to deepen their connection. These romantic escapes provided the perfect opportunity for poisoning, as she could control his food and drink intake completely while establishing alibis through hotel records and restaurant receipts. She administered cyanide through a variety of methods, sometimes in wine during intimate dinners, other times in coffee during quiet morning conversations. The symptoms she induced were attributed to stress and excitement associated with his new relationship. When Hyoki complained of fatigue and occasional chest pains, Kikihi suggested they were natural responses to the emotional intensity of falling in love at his age. She encouraged him to see these symptoms as positive signs that he was finally allowing himself to feel deeply rather than warning signals of physical danger. Hyoki's death occurred during what was supposed to be a celebration of their engagement. Kikihi had proposed a quiet dinner at his apartment, during which she administered a massive dose of cyanide in champagne intended to toast their future together. She watched him drink the poison with apparent joy, toasting their happiness while knowing she was witnessing his final conscious moments. The agony that followed was swift but intense. Hyoki experienced the full spectrum of cyanide poisoning: burning sensations in his throat, severe abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, and ultimately, complete cardiovascular collapse. Throughout his suffering, Kikihi maintained her role as the concerned fiancé, calling emergency services and attempting apparent resuscitation efforts that were actually designed to prevent any chance of survival. Her fourth victim, Minoru Hayoki, no relation to Masaki despite the shared surname, was perhaps the most tragic of her kills because he had specifically sought her out for companionship rather than romance. At 78, Minoru was struggling with the loneliness that followed his wife's death and had contacted Kikihi through a mutual acquaintance who spoke highly of her character and kindness. He was seeking friendship rather than passion, someone to share meals and conversation with during his remaining years. Kikihi's approach to Minoru required exceptional patience and subtlety. She couldn't rely on romantic infatuation to blind him to potential dangers, so she had to establish trust through consistent demonstrations of genuine care and concern. She visited him regularly, helped with household tasks, and gradually assumed responsibility for his meal preparation and medication management. Her performance was so convincing that his adult children began to view her as a blessing, a kind woman who was helping their father cope with widowerhood. The poisoning of Minoru Hayoki was her most sophisticated yet, administered over nearly 6 months through a combination of methods that made detection virtually impossible. She mixed cyanide compounds into his regular medications, gradually increasing the dosages while documenting symptoms that appeared to indicate natural deterioration associated with advancing age. She also began preparing all his meals, incorporating poison into dishes he particularly enjoyed while maintaining detailed records of his dietary intake and health responses. Minoru's decline was heartbreakingly gradual. He experienced increasing weakness, occasional confusion, and digestive problems that his physician attributed to normal aging processes. His appetite decreased steadily, which allowed Kikihi to concentrate the poison in smaller portions of food while appearing deeply concerned about his nutritional intake. She consulted with medical professionals about his condition, always presenting herself as the devoted friend who was desperately trying to help him maintain his health and independence. The final administration of poison came during a dinner she had prepared to celebrate his birthday. Kikihi had invited his children to join them, ensuring that multiple witnesses would observe both his final decline and her apparent devotion to his well-being. She mixed a concentrated dose of cyanide into his favorite dessert, watching him savor what she knew would be his last meal while engaging in cheerful conversation about plans for the upcoming year. Minoru's death was particularly cruel because he had trusted her completely. His final words were expressions of gratitude for her friendship and care, acknowledgments of how much her presence had enriched his final months. He died believing he was surrounded by love, never suspecting that the woman holding his hand had systematically destroyed his body over months of careful poisoning. By the time Minoru Hayoki died in 2012, Kikihi had perfected her technique to the point where detection seemed impossible. She had learned to manipulate not just her victims, but their families, their physicians, and the entire investigative system. Each murder had built upon the lessons of the previous kills, creating a methodology so sophisticated that she appeared to be nothing more than an unfortunate woman who had experienced an unusual number of tragic losses. But her very success was beginning to create the pattern that would eventually lead to her downfall. For deaths in 5 years, all involving elderly men who had become romantically or emotionally involved with the same woman, represented a statistical anomaly that would eventually attract the attention of investigators capable of seeing beyond her carefully constructed facade. The Black Widow's web was becoming increasingly complex, but it was also becoming increasingly visible to those who knew how to look for it. The beginning of Chisako Kikihi's end came disguised as just another romantic opportunity, but her fifth and final victim, Yoshinori Kikihi, would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel her entire web of deception. At 75 years old, Yoshinori possessed the perfect combination of wealth, loneliness, and trust that had made her previous victims such easy prey. But this time, the very perfection of her crime would become the catalyst for her undoing. Yoshinori had been a successful industrialist who had built a modest fortune through decades of careful business management. Like her previous victims, he had lost his spouse years earlier and was struggling with the profound isolation that seemed to characterize elderly widowerhood in modern Japan. When he encountered Kikihi through a dating service specifically designed for mature adults seeking companionship, he believed he had found the answer to his prayers for meaningful connection in his final years. The courtship followed the now familiar pattern, but with subtle refinements that demonstrated how thoroughly Kikihi had mastered her deadly craft. She approached the relationship with the confidence of someone who had never failed, never been caught, never even been suspected. Her conversations with Yoshinori were peppered with references to her previous tragic losses, painting herself as a woman who had experienced more than her share of heartbreak but remained open to love despite the pain. The psychological manipulation had evolved into something approaching artistry. Kikihi knew exactly which emotional buttons to press, which fears to exploit, which dreams to encourage. She presented herself as someone who could provide not just companionship, but healing. A woman whose own suffering had given her unique insight into loss and recovery. Yoshinori found himself drawn not just to her apparent warmth and understanding, but to the possibility that loving her might somehow honor the memory of his deceased wife by proving that the human heart could love again without betraying previous commitments. Their wedding in 2013 was a quietly elegant affair that seemed to validate the possibility of second chances in love. Photographs from the ceremony show Yoshinori beaming with genuine happiness, while his bride maintained the perfect expression of quiet joy mixed with appropriate solemnity given their ages. The guests, a mixture of his business associates and their mutual acquaintances from the senior dating circuit, would later recall how perfectly suited the couple seemed, how obvious their mutual affection appeared to be. But this marriage would last exactly 1 month, a time frame that even for Kikihi was remarkably brief. The poisoning began immediately after their honeymoon, administered with a ruthlessness that suggested she had grown weary of the lengthy courtship process and was eager to claim her inheritance. Unlike her previous victims, who had been allowed to decline gradually over months, Yoshinori was subjected to massive doses of cyanide that produced symptoms too severe and too rapid to be easily attributed to natural causes. The acceleration of her timeline proved to be a critical error. Yoshinori's sudden decline, from apparent health to death in just 4 weeks, created exactly the kind of suspicious pattern that competent investigators would be trained to recognize. His symptoms were too dramatic, too swift, and too inconsistent with his previously stable health status to be easily explained by conventional medical conditions. Kikihi's final kill demonstrated both the pinnacle of her confidence and the beginning of her carelessness. She had become so convinced of her own invincibility that she failed to maintain the careful, patient approach that had made her previous murders so successful. When Yoshinori began experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress, respiratory difficulties, and cardiovascular irregularities just weeks after their wedding, she responded with her usual performance of concerned devotion, but the timeline was simply too compressed to be credible. The fatal dose was administered on a quiet evening in December 2013, mixed into tea that she served while they watched television together in their shared apartment. The symptoms manifested with terrifying intensity. Yoshinori experienced the full brutal spectrum of acute cyanide poisoning, including the characteristic burning sensation, severe muscle spasms, and the gradual shutdown of his respiratory system. Throughout his agony, Kikihi maintained her facade of horrified concern, calling emergency services with apparent panic while ensuring that no effective treatment could be administered in time to save him. But Yoshinori's death occurred in a changed investigative environment. The accumulation of suspicious deaths around Kikihi had finally attracted the attention of experienced detectives who specialized in cases involving potential serial killers. When emergency responders arrived at the apartment, they encountered not just another elderly man who had suffered apparent heart failure, but a crime scene that was part of an emerging pattern that demanded serious investigation. The autopsy on Yoshinori's body revealed massive concentrations of cyanide in his blood and tissue samples, levels so high that they could not be explained by any accidental exposure or environmental contamination. The medical examiner's findings triggered an immediate expansion of the investigation to include reviews of Kikihi's previous tragedies. And what investigators discovered was a web of death that stretched back over 6 years and claimed at least 6 lives. The unraveling came with shocking speed. Once investigators began examining the deaths of Honda, Isao Kikihi, Masaki Hayoki, Minoru Hayoki, and others connected to her, the pattern became undeniable. Each victim had been an elderly man seeking companionship, each had become romantically or emotionally involved with the same woman, and each had died under circumstances that, when viewed individually, seemed natural but, when examined collectively, suggested systematic poisoning. The forensic investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of her crimes. Investigators discovered evidence of cyanide purchases through various sources, including online suppliers and industrial contacts who had sold her the compounds under false pretenses. They found detailed records of her relationships with each victim, including correspondence that demonstrated her careful cultivation of emotional dependency and financial access. Most damning of all, they uncovered evidence that she had researched the effects of various poisons extensively, studying symptoms, detection methods, and investigative procedures. The arrest came in November 2014, nearly a year after Yoshinori's death, following one of the most complex criminal investigations in Japanese history. When police officers appeared at her door with a warrant, Kakihi maintained the same calm demeanor that had served her so well throughout her killing spree. She showed no surprise, no fear, no emotion whatsoever, only the flat effect of someone whose capacity for normal human feeling had been completely extinguished. The trial that followed captivated the Japanese public and horrified international observers. Evidence presented by prosecutors painted a picture of calculated evil that defied easy understanding. This was not a woman driven by passion, desperation, or mental illness, but someone who had turned murder into a lifestyle choice, who had systematically exploited the universal human need for love and companionship to satisfy her own desires for wealth and control. The testimony from surviving family members was particularly heart-wrenching. Children described watching their father's health decline under Kakihi's care, expressed gratitude for what they believed was her devoted attention to their loved ones, and struggled to comprehend how thoroughly they had been deceived. Friends and associates testified to her apparent kindness, her seeming devotion to each victim, and the convincing grief she had displayed at every funeral. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed a personality so thoroughly corrupted that experts struggled to find appropriate clinical categories to describe her condition. She demonstrated complete absence of empathy, remorse, or emotional connection to her victims. When asked about the pain she had caused, she responded with clinical detachment, describing her actions in terms of their effectiveness rather than their moral implications. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the emotional responses of others, unable to understand why anyone would be disturbed by what she clearly viewed as simply a particularly efficient method of achieving her goals. The verdict, when it came in 2017, was death, the harshest possible punishment under Japanese law, reserved only for the most heinous crimes. The judge's statement during sentencing was particularly damning, describing Kakihi's crimes as unprecedented in their cold calculation and complete disregard for human life. The court found that she had murdered at least 4 men definitively, with strong evidence suggesting additional victims whose deaths had not been fully investigated. Even facing execution, Kakihi showed no signs of remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Her final statement to the court was a rambling complaint about the unfairness of her treatment, the inadequacy of her legal representation, and the failure of others to understand her perspective. She never once mentioned her victims by name, never acknowledged their suffering, never expressed regret for the pain she had caused their families. The Black Widow of Kyoto's reign of terror had finally ended, but the scars she left behind would never fully heal. 6 families had been robbed of beloved fathers, grandfathers, and friends. Countless others who had trusted her with their emotions and their lives would forever question their judgment and their ability to recognize evil when it smiled back at them across a dinner table. As she sits on death row, awaiting the execution of her sentence, Chisako Kakihi remains largely unchanged by her conviction and punishment. She continues to maintain her innocence, continues to blame others for her situation, and continues to demonstrate the same complete absence of human empathy that made her crimes possible in the first place. She represents perhaps the purest example of evil in human form, someone who discovered that love could be weaponized, that trust could be exploited for deadly purposes, and that the very qualities that make us most human could be turned against us by someone who had abandoned humanity entirely. The legacy of the Black Widow serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, that monsters can hide behind grandmother's smiles, and that the capacity for calculated cruelty exists even in those we would least suspect. Her story stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, the need for thorough investigation when suspicious patterns emerge, and the recognition that some individuals are so thoroughly corrupted that they pose an existential threat to anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. In the end, justice prevailed, but only after 6 innocent men paid the ultimate price for their trust, their loneliness, and their fundamental belief that human connection was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Their deaths were not in vain if they serve as a warning to future generations about the existence of predators like Chisako Kikihi, and the deadly price of underestimating the evil that can lurk behind a loving smile. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 5. The Confession Killer. Sam Little's Reign of Terror. A serial killer's confession echoes through sterile prison walls, each word dripping with the weight of 93 murdered souls. Samuel McDowell Little, a hulking predator who prowled America's shadows for 5 decades, would become the most prolific serial killer in United States history. His massive hands, once instruments of unspeakable violence, now trembled as he sketched the faces of his victims. Women's society had forgotten, discarded like broken dolls on the margins of existence. The FBI's cold case files would soon explode with revelations so horrific that seasoned investigators would struggle to sleep. This is not merely a tale of murder. It is the chilling chronicle of how one man's insatiable hunger for death went undetected while he carved a bloody trail across an entire continent. Welcome to the nightmare that investigators call the most significant serial killer case in U.S. history. The humid Texas air hung heavy with foreboding on June 7, 1940, when Samuel McDowell Little drew his first breath in Reynolds, Georgia. Born to 16-year-old Bessie Little, an unwed mother struggling against the crushing weight of poverty and shame, Samuel's earliest moments were already stained with abandonment. His biological father remained a ghost, a nameless shadow who vanished before the child's arrival, leaving behind only genetic markers that would manifest in terrifying ways. Elizabeth Little, Sam's grandmother, reluctantly assumed custody of the unwanted infant. Her weathered hands, hardened by decades of domestic work in white households, would be the first to show him both tenderness and brutal discipline. The cramped shotgun house in Lorain, Ohio, where they eventually settled, became a crucible of dysfunction that would forge a killer's psychology. By age 4, Samuel's behavior had already begun its sinister evolution. Neighborhood pets disappeared with alarming frequency, their mutilated remains discovered in dark corners of abandoned buildings. The other children whispered fearful tales of little Sammy's games, disturbing rituals involving captured animals that ended in screams and blood. His grandmother's leather belt became a frequent companion, leaving welts across his back that would heal into permanent reminders of a childhood steeped in violence. School records from Glenville Elementary paint a portrait of a child already lost to darkness. Teachers reported that Samuel would sit motionless for hours, his dead eyes fixed on female classmates with an intensity that made educators uncomfortable. His massive frame, unusually developed for his age, cast ominous shadows across playground activities. By 10, he towered over his peers, his strength already capable of inflicting serious harm. The first documented incident of Samuel's predatory behavior occurred when he was 12. Mary Patterson, a classmate walking home through the industrial wasteland of Cleveland's East Side, found herself cornered in an alley by the hulking boy. His thick fingers wrapped around her throat as he pressed her against the grimy brick wall, her feet dangling inches from the ground. Only the intervention of a passing factory worker prevented what investigators would later recognize as Samuel's first attempted murder. Instead of counseling or intervention, the incident was dismissed as boys being boys. The seeds of a monster continued germinating in the toxic soil of neglect and systemic failure. Samuel learned a crucial lesson that day. Women were prey, and society would turn its blind eye to their suffering. His teenage years became a masterclass in escalating violence. Shoplifting evolved into armed robbery. Petty assault graduated to sexual battery. The Ohio juvenile detention system became Samuel's revolving door university of criminal education, where hardened delinquents taught him advanced techniques in manipulation, evasion, and predatory behavior. Each stint behind bars only sharpened his skills, transforming raw aggression into calculated malevolence. At 16, Samuel committed his first confirmed sexual assault. The victim, a 30-year-old waitress named Dorothy Hayes, was walking to her car after a late shift at a downtown Cleveland diner. Samuel emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given form, his massive hands silencing her screams before she could fully comprehend the horror descending upon her. He dragged her into the narrow space between two buildings, where the city's ambient noise drowned out her desperate pleas for mercy. The assault lasted 3 hours. Samuel's methodology was already sophisticated. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply to keep his victim conscious but compliant. He studied her terror with the cold fascination of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. When he finally released her, Dorothy's traumatized mind had fractured beyond repair. She would spend the remainder of her life in and out of psychiatric institutions, forever haunted by those dead eyes that had stared into her soul while he violated her. Police reports from the incident reveal the systemic prejudices that would allow Samuel to continue his reign of terror unchecked. Dorothy's credibility was immediately questioned due to her profession and the location of the attack. The detective assigned to her case spent more time investigating her personal life than pursuing her attacker. Within weeks, the file disappeared into the labyrinth of unsolved cases that cluttered Cleveland's overwhelmed police department. Samuel's transformation into a serial predator accelerated during his late teens. He developed what would become his signature hunting pattern, targeting women on society's periphery, sex workers, drug addicts, runaways, and the homeless. These were victims whose disappearances wouldn't trigger intensive investigations, whose deaths would barely register in newspaper crime statistics. His first confirmed murder occurred 3 days before his 18th birthday. The victim was Patricia Williams, a 19-year-old runaway from Detroit who had drifted into Cleveland's red light district. Samuel approached her with the practiced charm he had perfected, a soft-spoken giant offering protection in a dangerous world. Patricia, desperate for someone who seemed to care, followed him to an abandoned warehouse in the Flats industrial district. The killing was brutal beyond description. Samuel's massive hands encircled Patricia's throat as he lifted her from the ground, her legs kicking frantically in the stale air. But strangulation wasn't enough to satisfy the monster stirring within him. He needed to feel her life force drain away slowly, to savor every moment of her terror and helplessness. He released pressure intermittently, allowing oxygen to flood back into her brain just as consciousness began to fade, prolonging her agony for his twisted pleasure. When Patricia's struggles finally ceased, Samuel experienced what he would later describe as an almost religious ecstasy. The power he held over life and death intoxicated him more thoroughly than any narcotic. He spent hours with her corpse, arranging and rearranging her limbs, studying the way death had transformed her features. This post-mortem ritual would become a crucial element of his methodology. Patricia's body was discovered 2 weeks later by urban explorers, her remains so decomposed that identification proved nearly impossible. The coroner's report attributed her death to probable strangulation, but the lack of witnesses, evidence, or suspects meant the case joined thousands of others in the unsolved files. Samuel had committed the perfect crime, and he knew it. The psychological intoxication of successful murder transformed Samuel's worldview completely. He began viewing potential victims not as human beings, but as objects existing solely for his gratification. His hunting grounds expanded beyond Cleveland as he realized that mobility was key to avoiding detection. He acquired a series of stolen vehicles and began crisscrossing the Midwest, leaving a trail of terror that no single jurisdiction could connect. His killing methodology evolved with each subsequent murder. Samuel discovered that his enormous hands were perfectly designed instruments of death. He could crush a windpipe in seconds or slowly throttle a victim while watching the light fade from their eyes. He developed an almost supernatural ability to gauge exactly how much pressure would render someone unconscious versus dead, allowing him to toy with his prey like a cat torturing a mouse. The summer of 1959 marked a horrific escalation in Samuel's activities. Over the course of 4 months, he murdered 7 women across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Each killing was more sadistic than the last as he refined his techniques and explored new methods of inflicting terror. He began incorporating sexual assault as a prelude to murder, discovering that the combination of physical violation and impending death created a unique brand of victim helplessness that fed his psychological hunger. Law enforcement agencies remained completely oblivious to the monster operating in their jurisdictions. The absence of modern communication systems meant that murders in different states were treated as isolated incidents. Samuel's careful victim selection ensured that investigations remained low-priority affairs, quickly abandoned when leads went cold. He had become the perfect invisible predator, moving through society's blind spots like a malevolent ghost. By his 19th birthday, Samuel Little had already claimed at least 12 lives. His transformation from troubled child to sophisticated serial killer was complete. The psychological architecture that would support 50 years of murder had been constructed, built upon a foundation of childhood trauma, societal neglect, and his own inherent capacity for evil. The monster was ready to feed, and America would provide an endless buffet of vulnerable prey. Samuel Little's reign of terror had officially begun, though it would take investigators nearly 6 decades to comprehend the true scope of his horrific legacy. The shadows that had birthed him would soon stretch across an entire continent, and the body count would climb to numbers that defied human comprehension. The 1960s dawned with Samuel Little already a seasoned killer, his methodology honed through years of trial and error. At 20 years old, he had perfected the art of murder while remaining completely invisible to law enforcement. His victims lay scattered across multiple states, their deaths attributed to everything except the truth. A calculating predator was systematically hunting America's most vulnerable women. Samuel's nomadic lifestyle became his greatest weapon. He acquired documentation under various aliases: Samuel McDowell, his birth name, along with dozens of fabricated identities complete with forged papers. His massive frame and nondescript features allowed him to blend into the criminal underworld of any city, just another drifter seeking work and shelter. This anonymity was crucial to his survival as a serial killer. The decade's social upheaval provided perfect cover for Samuel's activities. America was transforming, with traditional communities fracturing under the pressure of urbanization and cultural revolution. Millions of people were constantly on the move, following jobs, escaping troubled pasts, or simply seeking something better. A woman's disappearance from a bus station or truck stop could easily be attributed to voluntary relocation rather than murder. Samuel's hunting patterns evolved into a sophisticated system of predation. He would arrive in a new city and spend weeks observing potential targets, learning their routines and identifying the most vulnerable opportunities. His preference for marginalized victims wasn't merely practical. These women fed his psychological need to dominate the powerless. Sex workers, drug addicts, and runaways became his specialty because society had already discarded them as worthless. The murder of Linda Harrison in Detroit marked a terrifying escalation in Samuel's savagery. Linda, a 23-year-old heroin addict working the streets to support her habit, encountered Samuel outside a downtown bar in March 1963. His approach was perfected charm. He offered her a safe place to sleep and promised steady money for her services. Linda, desperate and exhausted, made the fatal mistake of trusting the gentle giant. Samuel led Linda to an abandoned factory in Detroit's industrial district, a labyrinth of rusted machinery and broken dreams. Once inside, his demeanor transformed completely. The kind stranger disappeared, replaced by a creature of pure malevolence. Samuel's massive hands seized Linda's throat, lifting her feet from the ground as her eyes widened in terror and recognition of impending death. But this killing was different. Samuel had discovered that prolonging the death process amplified his psychological gratification exponentially. He would strangle Linda to the edge of unconsciousness, then release pressure, allowing her to gasp desperately for air while he studied her terror. This cycle continued for hours, each near-death experience more traumatic than the last, until Linda's mind shattered under the psychological torture. When he finally allowed Linda to die, Samuel spent the entire night with her corpse. He arranged her body in various positions, photographing her with a stolen camera to preserve the memory of his triumph. These photographs would become part of his growing collection of trophies, souvenirs of his godlike power over life and death. Linda's disappearance barely registered with Detroit police. She was just another junkie who had probably overdosed or moved on to another city. The cursory investigation lasted less than a week before her file joined thousands of others gathering dust in storage. Samuel had once again committed the perfect crime. The mid-1960s witnessed Samuel's methodical expansion across the American landscape. He traveled extensively throughout the South, where racial tensions and social instability provided excellent cover for his activities. Police departments were understaffed and overwhelmed, particularly when it came to investigating crimes against minorities and the socially marginalized. In Atlanta, Samuel murdered 3 women within a 6-month period during 1965. Each killing was more elaborate than the last as he experimented with different techniques of torture and domination. Margaret Foster, a 40-year-old domestic worker, was strangled in her own apartment after Samuel convinced her landlord he was her nephew visiting from out of town. Her body wasn't discovered for 2 weeks, giving Samuel ample time to disappear into the urban maze. The second Atlanta victim was Teresa Johnson, a 19-year-old runaway from Alabama who had been selling her body to survive on the streets. Samuel approached her with an offer too good to refuse: steady work as a housekeeper for a wealthy family. Teresa's desperation overrode her survival instincts, and she followed him to what she believed would be salvation but found only death. Samuel's torture of Teresa lasted 3 days. He held her captive in a rented basement apartment, slowly breaking down her psychological defenses through a calculated combination of false hope and escalating terror. He would release her restraints and pretend to let her go, only to recapture her moments before she reached potential freedom. This psychological warfare was as important to Samuel as the physical violence. He needed to own his victims' souls completely before destroying their bodies. The third Atlanta murder demonstrated Samuel's increasing sophistication in victim disposal. Dorothy Martinez, a 25-year-old mother of 2 struggling with alcoholism, simply vanished without a trace. Samuel had perfected techniques for completely destroying bodies, using industrial chemicals and remote locations to ensure no physical evidence would ever surface. Dorothy's children would grow up never knowing what happened to their mother, while Samuel moved on to his next hunting ground. By 1967, Samuel's body count had exceeded 30 confirmed victims, though the true number was likely much higher. His methodology had evolved into a terrifying efficiency that maximized both his psychological satisfaction and his chances of avoiding detection. He had become America's most successful serial killer, and law enforcement remained completely unaware of his existence. The late 1960s brought Samuel to California, where the Cultural Revolution provided perfect camouflage for his activities. The state's transient population, combined with overwhelmed police departments dealing with widespread social unrest, created ideal conditions for a serial predator. Samuel established bases of operation in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, creating a triangle of terror that would persist for decades. His California killing spree began with the murder of Patricia Lewis in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. Patricia, a 22-year-old from Ohio who had come west seeking a new life, instead found Samuel waiting in the shadows. He approached her outside a bus station, offering dinner and a place to stay while she got established in the city. Patricia's trusting nature sealed her fate. Samuel's torture chamber was a rented warehouse in the city's industrial district. He had spent weeks preparing the location, soundproofing the walls and installing specialized equipment designed to prolong his victims' suffering. Patricia's ordeal lasted 4 days, during which Samuel explored new depths of sadistic creativity. He used her terror and pain as raw material for his twisted artistic expression, treating her dying body as a canvas for his depravity. The murder of Patricia Lewis marked a crucial evolution in Samuel's methodology. He began incorporating elements of ritualistic behavior, treating each killing as a sacred ceremony that connected him to some primal source of power. He would paint symbols on his victims' bodies using their own blood, creating makeshift altars from their personal belongings, and performing bizarre rites over their corpses. These ritual elements weren't random. They followed a consistent pattern that revealed the organized nature of Samuel's psychosis. He was operating according to an internal logic that made perfect sense to his fractured mind, even as it appeared completely insane to any outside observer. This ritualistic behavior would eventually become one of the key elements investigators used to connect his crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Samuel's Los Angeles operations were equally horrific. Between 1968 and 1970, he murdered at least 8 women in the greater LA area, each killing more elaborate than the last. The city's sprawling geography and fragmented law enforcement structure provided excellent cover for his activities. Victims could disappear in Hollywood, and their bodies could surface in Long Beach without anyone connecting the dots. The murder of Angela Rodriguez in East LA demonstrated Samuel's growing confidence and brazenness. Angela, a 26-year-old mother of 3 who cleaned offices at night to support her family, was abducted from a bus stop while waiting to go home after her shift. Samuel had been stalking her for weeks, learning her routine and identifying the perfect moment to strike. Angela's death was particularly brutal even by Samuel's standards. He had discovered that mothers were the most psychologically vulnerable victims because their terror was amplified by concern for their children. He would taunt Angela with descriptions of what would happen to her kids when she failed to return home, using her maternal instincts as instruments of torture. The killing lasted an entire weekend, with Samuel systematically breaking down Angela's psychological defenses while inflicting increasingly severe physical trauma. He photographed every stage of her deterioration, creating a visual record of her transformation from loving mother to broken victim. These photographs joined his growing collection of trophies, tangible proof of his absolute power over life and death. By 1970, Samuel Little had murdered at least 50 women across multiple states, though investigators would later estimate the true number was much higher. His killing had become an art form, with each victim serving as both psychological release and creative expression. He had perfected techniques that satisfied his deepest psychological needs while maintaining perfect operational security. The decade of the 1960s established Samuel as America's most prolific serial killer, though his very existence remained unknown to law enforcement. His victims lay scattered across the continent like broken dolls, their deaths attributed to everything except the truth. A monster was walking among us, and he was just getting started. The worst was yet to come. The 1970s unleashed Samuel Little's most prolific killing period, transforming him from a regional threat into America's deadliest predator. His methodology had reached murderous perfection, combining psychological torture with physical brutality in ways that defied human comprehension. By this time, his victim count had exceeded 60 confirmed murders, though the true number would prove catastrophically higher. Samuel's operational base had expanded to encompass the entire American continent. He maintained safe houses and killing grounds from coast to coast, creating a network of terror that spanned thousands of miles. His mobility remained his greatest asset. Police departments still operated in isolation, unable to connect crimes across jurisdictional boundaries. This fragmentation allowed Samuel to murder with virtual impunity. The decade began with one of Samuel's most sadistic killings. In January 1971, he encountered Maria Santos outside a Dallas bus terminal. Maria, a 17-year-old runaway from Mexico seeking work to send money home to her family, represented everything Samuel found irresistible in a victim: youth, vulnerability, and social invisibility. Her limited English and undocumented status made her the perfect target. Samuel approached Maria with practiced deception, claiming to represent an employment agency that specialized in placing domestic workers with wealthy families. He showed her forged documents and testimonials, painting a picture of legitimate opportunity that seemed too good to pass up. Maria's desperation to escape poverty overruled her instincts, and she followed her killer to what she believed would be salvation. The abandoned ranch house outside Dallas became Maria's tomb. Samuel had purchased the property using forged identification, creating a perfect killing ground miles from any neighbors or witnesses. The isolation allowed him to indulge his most depraved fantasies without fear of interruption. Maria's ordeal would last 2 weeks, becoming one of the longest torture sessions in Samuel's horrific career. Samuel's methodology had evolved to include sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to break his victim's will to resist. He would alternate between false kindness and explosive violence, creating a trauma bond that left victims completely dependent on their captor's moods. Maria experienced this cycle dozens of times, her psyche fragmenting under the constant uncertainty of Samuel's intentions. The physical torture was equally systematic. Samuel had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of human anatomy, understanding exactly how much damage a body could sustain while keeping the victim conscious and responsive. He used Maria as a living laboratory, testing the limits of human endurance while documenting his experiments with photographs and detailed notes. When Maria finally died, Samuel spent days with her corpse, treating it as a masterpiece worthy of extended contemplation. He had discovered that the post-mortem period was almost as psychologically satisfying as the killing itself. The absolute stillness of death, combined with his godlike power over the corpse, fed his narcissistic need for complete domination. Maria's disappearance generated no police investigation whatsoever. She was an undocumented immigrant whose absence wouldn't be reported to American authorities. Her family in Mexico would wait months for letters that would never come, gradually accepting that their daughter had vanished into the vast American landscape. Samuel had achieved the perfect invisible murder. The mid-1970s witnessed Samuel's most intense killing spree. Between 1974 and 1978, he murdered at least 25 women across 8 different states. His techniques had reached peak efficiency, allowing him to kill multiple victims in rapid succession without leaving evidence that could connect the crimes. Each murder was a symphony of terror orchestrated by a master craftsman of death. In Chicago, Samuel targeted the city's south side, where poverty and social chaos provided perfect hunting conditions. His first victim was Denise Washington, a 24-year-old mother of 2 who worked double shifts at a factory to support her children. Samuel studied her routine for weeks, identifying her vulnerability during the long walk from the bus stop to her apartment building. The attack occurred on a freezing February night in 1975. Samuel dragged Denise into an abandoned building, where her screams were absorbed by the industrial noise of the surrounding neighborhood. His assault combined sexual violence with systematic strangulation, creating a hellish experience that lasted hours. Denise's children would wake up the next morning to find their mother had simply vanished from existence. Samuel's Chicago operations expanded rapidly. Within 6 months, he had murdered 5 more women in the area, each killing more elaborate than the last. The local police department was overwhelmed by gang violence and drug-related crimes, treating these murders as isolated incidents rather than the work of a serial predator. Samuel's careful victim selection ensured that investigations remained low priority. The murder of Katherine Johnson in Detroit marked another evolution in Samuel's technique. Katherine, a 19-year-old college student working part-time as a waitress, represented a departure from his usual victim profile. Her middle-class background and stable family connections made her disappearance more likely to generate intensive investigation. Samuel was testing his skills against higher-stakes prey. Samuel's approach required weeks of preparation. He studied Katherine's schedule, identifying the narrow window of vulnerability during her late-night walks from work to her car. He rented an apartment near her route and practiced the abduction countless times, refining every detail until the plan was flawless. When he finally struck, the kidnapping was completed in less than 30 seconds. Katherine's torture lasted 5 days, during which Samuel explored new depths of psychological cruelty. He forced her to write letters to her family describing fictional scenarios of voluntary disappearance, creating false trails that would misdirect the subsequent investigation. He made her recite details about her loved ones while he violated her, using her emotional connections as weapons against her spirit. The murder itself was Samuel's most ritualistic to date. He had developed an elaborate ceremony involving candles, symbols drawn in blood, and specific positioning of the corpse. These elements weren't random. They followed a consistent pattern that revealed the organized nature of his psychosis. Samuel was operating according to an internal mythology that transformed murder into religious experience. Katherine's body was never found. Samuel had perfected techniques for complete corpse disposal, using industrial chemicals and remote locations to ensure no physical evidence would surface. The intensive police investigation lasted months but ultimately concluded that Katherine had voluntarily disappeared, possibly to escape family pressures or academic stress. By 1978, Samuel's methodology had reached its ultimate form. He could identify, stalk, abduct, torture, kill, and dispose of victims with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. His psychological techniques for breaking down resistance were so sophisticated that victims often stopped struggling long before death, accepting their fate with broken resignation. The late 1970s brought Samuel back to California, where he established a killing ground in Los Angeles that would operate for over a decade. The city's sprawling geography and transient population provided perfect cover for sustained operations. Samuel rented multiple properties under different identities, creating a network of safe houses and torture chambers throughout the metropolitan area. His California victims included some of his most brutal killings. Jennifer Martinez, a 23-year-old aspiring actress, was lured to a fake audition in Hollywood. Samuel had created an elaborate fiction involving a legitimate film production, complete with forged documents and professional-looking materials. Jennifer's dreams of stardom made her vulnerable to this sophisticated deception. The murder took place in Samuel's specially prepared warehouse in the San Fernando Valley. He had transformed the space into a hellish theater where he could indulge his most depraved fantasies without interruption. Jennifer's ordeal lasted a week, during which Samuel systematically destroyed every aspect of her identity and humanity. Samuel's psychological techniques had evolved to include elaborate role-playing scenarios designed to maximize victim trauma. He would force his captives to participate in twisted performances, treating their terror and pain as entertainment. These sessions were carefully choreographed productions that satisfied his narcissistic need for absolute control over every aspect of the experience. The decade concluded with Samuel's most ambitious killing spree. Between December 1979 and March 1980, he murdered 7 women across 4 different states, moving with lightning speed to avoid detection. Each killing was perfectly executed, leaving no evidence that could connect the crimes or identify the perpetrator. Samuel had become the ultimate invisible predator. The 1970s established Samuel Little as the most prolific serial killer in American history, though law enforcement remained completely unaware of his existence. His victims lay scattered across the continent like broken promises, their deaths attributed to everything except the truth. A monster was walking among us, and he had perfected the art of murder to a degree that defied human comprehension. The next decade would see Samuel's killing reach its absolute peak, as he refined his techniques to achieve perfect operational security while satisfying his deepest psychological needs. The worst was yet to come, and America's most vulnerable women would pay the ultimate price for society's failure to recognize the predator in their midst. The 1980s marked the apex of Samuel Little's killing career, a blood-soaked decade that would see his victim count soar past the century mark. His methodology had achieved murderous perfection, combining 5 decades of experience into a killing machine of unprecedented efficiency. Law enforcement remained completely oblivious to the monster operating in their midst, while Samuel continued his systematic extermination of America's most vulnerable women. Samuel's operations had expanded to encompass the entire North American continent. He maintained killing grounds from Vancouver to Miami, creating a network of terror that spanned thousands of miles. His mobility remained his greatest weapon. Advanced victim selection, perfected disposal techniques, and sophisticated false identity systems allowed him to murder with complete impunity. The decade began with Samuel's most audacious killing spree. In the first 6 months of 1980, he murdered 12 women across 7 different states, moving with supernatural speed to avoid detection. Each killing was more elaborate than the last as he pushed the boundaries of human endurance and psychological torture. His victims ranged in age from 16 to 60, representing every demographic of society's forgotten women. The murder of Rebecca Thompson in Phoenix established new standards of brutality even for Samuel. Rebecca, a 28-year-old mother of 4 struggling with addiction, represented the perfect victim profile: desperate, isolated, and unlikely to be missed quickly. Samuel approached her outside a methadone clinic, offering steady money for housekeeping work that would allow her to get clean and regain custody of her children. Samuel's Phoenix safe house was a suburban ranch home that he had purchased using forged documents. The property's isolation and soundproofing made it perfect for extended torture sessions. Rebecca's ordeal lasted 3 weeks, during which Samuel systematically destroyed every aspect of her personality and humanity. He used her maternal instincts as weapons, describing in graphic detail what would happen to her children when she failed to return home. The psychological torture was as sophisticated as the physical abuse. Samuel had developed techniques for breaking down his victims' psychological defenses that were more effective than any physical violence. He would alternate between false kindness and explosive brutality, creating trauma bonds that left victims completely dependent on their captors' moods. Rebecca experienced this cycle dozens of times, her sanity fragmenting under the constant uncertainty. When Rebecca finally died, Samuel spent 2 weeks with her corpse, treating it as a masterpiece worthy of extended contemplation. He had developed elaborate post-mortem rituals that were as important to his psychological satisfaction as the killing itself. These ceremonies involved positioning the body in specific ways, creating makeshift altars from personal belongings, and performing bizarre rites that connected him to some primal source of power. Rebecca's disappearance generated minimal police investigation. She was a known addict whose absence could easily be attributed to relapse or voluntary disappearance. Her children were placed in foster care, their mother's fate destined to remain forever unknown. Samuel had once again achieved the perfect invisible murder. The mid-1980s witnessed Samuel's most systematic approach to serial killing. He had divided the country into hunting zones, spending several months in each area before moving on to avoid establishing recognizable patterns. His technique had evolved to include sophisticated surveillance methods that allowed him to study potential victims for weeks before striking. In Detroit, Samuel's operations reached industrial scale. Between 1983 and 1985, he murdered at least 15 women in the greater metropolitan area, each killing more elaborate than the last. The city's economic collapse had created perfect conditions for a serial predator: overwhelmed police departments, widespread poverty, and a large population of vulnerable women struggling to survive. His Detroit victims included some of his most savage killings. Linda Parker, a 25-year-old former factory worker turned sex worker after losing her job, encountered Samuel outside a downtown bar in March 1984. His approach was perfected charm. He offered her a safe place to sleep and promised steady money that would allow her to escape street life. Linda's desperation overrode her survival instincts, sealing her fate. Samuel's Detroit torture chamber was an abandoned warehouse in the city's industrial district, a labyrinth of rusted machinery and broken dreams. He had spent months preparing the location, installing specialized equipment designed to prolong his victims' suffering while preventing any possibility of escape or rescue. Linda's ordeal lasted 10 days, during which Samuel explored new depths of sadistic creativity. The murder itself represented the culmination of Samuel's ritualistic evolution. He had developed an elaborate ceremony involving specific positioning of the victim, symbols drawn in blood, and complex rites that transformed killing into religious experience. These weren't random elements. They followed consistent patterns that revealed the organized nature of his psychosis. Linda's body was never recovered. Samuel had perfected techniques for complete corpse disposal that left no trace of his crimes. Industrial chemicals, remote locations, and sophisticated body destruction methods ensured that his victims simply vanished from existence. The police investigation lasted less than a week before Linda's file joined thousands of others gathering dust in storage. The late 1980s brought Samuel's most ambitious project: the systematic targeting of sex workers along major interstate highways. His mobile operations allowed him to strike repeatedly while maintaining perfect anonymity. Truck stops, rest areas, and highway motels became hunting grounds where vulnerable women disappeared without generating significant investigation. The Interstate 40 corridor became Samuel's primary hunting ground, stretching from California to North Carolina. He established safe houses and disposal sites along the entire route, creating a network of death that spanned half the continent. His victims were women working the truck stops, runaways seeking transportation, and hitchhikers trying to reach distant destinations. Patricia Adams, a 19-year-old runaway from Oregon, encountered Samuel at a truck stop outside Amarillo, Texas. She was trying to reach Florida, where she believed relatives would help her start a new life. Samuel offered her a ride and told convincing stories about his legitimate trucking business. Patricia's youth and inexperience made her the perfect victim for his highway operations. The murder took place in Samuel's specially equipped semi-trailer, a mobile torture chamber that allowed him to kill while constantly moving. Patricia's ordeal lasted 4 days as Samuel drove across 3 states, stopping only to refuel and continue her systematic destruction. The isolation and mobility made rescue impossible while providing perfect operational security. Samuel's highway operations expanded rapidly throughout the late 1980s. He acquired multiple commercial vehicles and established disposal sites at regular intervals along major trucking routes. This network allowed him to kill continuously while maintaining perfect anonymity. Victims would disappear at truck stops and their bodies would surface hundreds of miles away, if they were ever found at all. By 1988, Samuel's victim count had exceeded 100 confirmed murders, though the true number was likely much higher. His killing had become an art form that combined psychological torture with physical brutality in ways that defied human comprehension. He had achieved perfect operational security while satisfying his deepest psychological needs. The decade concluded with Samuel's most elaborate killing spree. Between October and December 1989, he murdered 9 women across 6 different states, each killing more ritualistic than the last. These murders represented the culmination of 5 decades of refinement, combining every technique he had perfected into ultimate expressions of his twisted artistry. However, the 1990s would bring unexpected challenges to Samuel's operations. Advances in forensic science, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, and changing social attitudes toward violence against women would gradually close the loopholes that had allowed his decades-long killing spree to continue undetected. The first sign of trouble came in 1994 when Samuel was arrested in California on minor drug charges. During processing, his fingerprints were entered into newly computerized databases that began connecting cold cases across multiple jurisdictions. Though released after serving a short sentence, the arrest had created a digital trail that would eventually lead to his downfall. Samuel's killing continued throughout the 1990s and 2000s, though at a reduced pace as increased surveillance and forensic capabilities made his operations more dangerous. He adapted by becoming even more selective in his victim choice and more sophisticated in his disposal methods, but the noose was slowly tightening around his neck. The final chapter of Samuel Little's reign of terror began in 2012 when DNA evidence connected him to 3 murders in California. At age 72, the aging giant was finally arrested and charged with crimes that represented only a fraction of his actual victims. The investigation that followed would reveal the true scope of his horrific legacy. In prison, Samuel made the decision that would define his final years. He began confessing to his crimes. Not out of remorse, he remained a psychopath incapable of genuine emotion, but because he wanted credit for his accomplishments. Over the course of hundreds of hours of interviews, he would admit to 93 murders, providing details that only the killer could know. Samuel Little died in a California prison hospital on December 30th, 2020, at age 80. His death marked the end of the most prolific serial killing spree in American history, but the true scope of his crimes may never be fully known. FBI investigators believe he may have murdered as many as 200 women across 5 decades, making him responsible for more deaths than any other serial killer in recorded history. The monster's confessions provided closure for some families, while opening fresh wounds for others. His detailed sketches of victims helped identify dozens of Jane Does who had languished in morgues for decades, finally giving names to the nameless and allowing families to grieve properly. Yet for every victim identified, investigators believe several more remain lost to history, their deaths unrecorded and their families still waiting for answers that will never come. Samuel Little's legacy stands as a testament to society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members. His victims were predominantly women of color, sex workers, drug addicts, and the homeless, people whose deaths barely registered with law enforcement or the media. Their invisibility in life became their curse in death, allowing a monster to hunt them with impunity for 5 decades. The case revolutionized how law enforcement approaches serial killing investigations. The FBI's violent criminal apprehension program expanded dramatically in response to Little's crimes, creating better communication networks between jurisdictions and improving techniques for identifying patterns across multiple cases. But these advances came too late for the 93 confirmed victims who died while America's justice system failed them. As investigators continue reviewing cold cases across the country, Samuel Little's victim count continues to rise. Each newly connected murder adds another name to the roll call of the forgotten. Another life destroyed by a predator who walked among us undetected for half a century. His story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters are real, and they often hide in plain sight while society looks the other way. The nightmare of Samuel Little is finally over, but his victims' names echo through the corridors of American criminal justice as a perpetual reminder of our collective failure. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends, human beings whose lives mattered, even if society only acknowledged their worth after death. Their silence has been broken at last, and their killer's name will forever be synonymous with the darkest chapters of American criminal history. In death, Samuel Little achieved the notoriety he craved in life, but history will remember him not as the master predator he believed himself to be, but as the cowardly monster who preyed on society's most vulnerable members. His victims, finally given voice through the FBI's investigation, stand as monuments to resilience in the face of ultimate evil. Their stories, now told, ensure that Samuel Little's crimes will never be forgotten, and perhaps never repeated on such a horrific scale again. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. Your support means the world to me, and if you enjoyed the journey, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.